Hey everyone, this is GM Josh Friedel. Today I'll be commenting on the Select Chess Invitational run by the St. Louis Chess Club. So it's going to start in about a minute and a half. I'll be commenting on these games. It's a 15-0 rapid event on Lee Chess. 5 rounds, 1 minute between the rounds, so going to be a pretty rapid pace. And yeah, we'll see how things go. So, yeah, so as far as some of the players go, we have Aaron's son is Aaron Lin, and Sandro Argonaut is Alexander Sechelashvili. Chess Logic is Alex Zhang, who's our #1 seed. And casual player is Aradia Panda. So as you can see, we have a pretty big range from 2300 Lee Chess rating at least, which again, a lot of these guys are provisional and it's rapid, so the rating doesn't always mean that much. But a bunch of people who haven't played rapid on here before, so it should be an interesting tournament. We'll see how it goes. Should be started in about 10 minutes. I'm going to jump around a little, but my own commentary style tends to be, I like to stick to games for a little while so that it's not just constant jumping. I find that to be kind of annoying. So we'll see where it takes us. So I guess we'll start with, we have someone else we have someone with a bye, that's why. Okay, so let's see. Who should we start with? I suppose we'll go with, which game are we going to go with? It's always these decisions to make, you know? Let us go with maybe Sandro Argonaut. Try this one. So this is Sandro Argonaut is white against Chess Logic, who is black. So we have a London system. Black chooses a kind of Queen's Indian setup against it, which is one of the ones which it makes a lot of sense. So there are definitely quite a few options you have. So black goes for d5. The other one is to try to go with c5, takes, and put a pawn on d6 and go for a hedgehog type structure. Both of them, of course, are perfectly legitimate ways of playing. Black instead chooses to go with d5. So usually with d5, the idea is it allows you to put your bishop on a more active square at d6, which you see black does. So you see both players are playing relatively fast. It's still early in the game. One of the things I would say is that it's 15-0, so falling behind on time too much can be a real problem. Because if you get very low, there's no increment to kind of keep you alive. So time management in these games is going to be really crucial. You'll notice white does another typical maneuver. Rather than trading the bishops, puts a knight on e5 to maybe cement it with a move like f4 sometimes. Although I would say that here, you have to be very careful, because if you allow a knight into e4 followed by f6, you might find that this knight is actually not such a strength. And in fact, I might have played, if I were white here, I might have tried knight here first, just to kind of avoid this sort of scenario. Although honestly, it's probably both are fine. And in fact, black does play with this way. So I don't know, allowing f6, especially with this kind of structure, like that bishop on g3 is actually not that great. So as a move like f6, maybe just knight d7, eventually playing with c5, might end up being quite good for black here. But again, it's still kind of early in the opening, plenty of things happening, so it's not like anything too significant is going on. I guess we can check other games. Again, it's just the opening, so I don't want to linger too much. Oops, that's a little weird, didn't update. Let us see. So we have other games. I'm going to try to find one with a bit more action going on, and then I'll switch back to maybe this one. So let us see. I'd say this game actually has some interest. So this is Aaron Sunboy against St. Louis N6. So Aaron Sunboy is black. So in this position, we have a kind of hanging pawns position, which is fairly typical. But we have a bishop here, which is not typical. Usually this bishop is actually back here, trying to support the knight, trying to support the pawns. But the advantage of having the bishop here is that sometimes you can create counterplay by putting pressure against the knight. So for example, something like queen out here, sometimes even knight e4 type moves can come into play. But of course, you have to be very careful, and I would say that white's bishop is extremely active along this diagonal, which is not always something that's so pleasant. So the key with the hanging pawns is, first of all, you have to make sure they don't hang, which I guess goes in the name. But you also have to make sure that these pawns eventually can sometimes become a strength. If you, for example, threaten d4 opening up your bishop at some point, these pawns can be quite strong. So it's really kind of a question of how you're able to use them. But I would say that with the hanging pawns, you have to play very actively. So for example, a move like this, I'm not usually that crazy about because I'm not sure the queen wants to be here, first of all. But second of all, it's just not that active. So normally the queen likes to be a square like this, maybe even e6 is a good square for the queen in these positions because it holds onto your center nicely. But in this case, I want to use my bishop here. So I would actually consider queen out here with the idea of taking this knight and maybe putting my knight on e4 and playing very, very actively in that manner. The queen on c7, I'm not a huge fan of. So white goes a3. Probably, again, you should take this knight and put a knight on d5 on e4. I think you have to play quite actively here. I'm not crazy about the move a3. I would have maybe tried maybe fixing the bishop. Even a move like bishop f4 is a playable option, but you had quite a few options. Even moving this knight was not so stupid. But I definitely think that black should think about taking this knight. But what I do like is that both players seem to be weighing their decisions, but not playing too slowly. I actually just commented for another event, believe it or not. And in that event, I would say one of the sections, particularly the K through 6 section, the players just play so blindingly fast, and they even had increment. But they were just missing kind of everything. So I think these guys are playing at a nice deliberate pace, which I think is very good. So yeah, taking the knight is sensible because the bishop here would be kind of bad, and then bringing the knight in. So this forks the bishop and queen. Obviously the queen's going to move, and then the question is, do you want to take the bishop? It seems obvious that you want to take it, and I think here you probably should, but there are situations where taking the bishop's not even that great of a piece, whereas this knight is quite good. So it's kind of a decision to make. The queen goes back to c2, which I think makes sense. So yeah, here probably you should take, and then of course the mate is threatened, so you bring the knight here to guard against the mate and also guard your center. But I would say that black has to be careful not to simplify too much, because then these pawns become weaker the more pieces come off the board. But I would say that with the knight on f6, bishop on b7, the rook's coming to the center, maybe rook e8, rook d8, ideas of d4, I think that black should be not too unhappy here. But you have to be very careful, of course, about your pawns suddenly becoming hanging. So I suppose we can move to another game. Let us see what's happening. So this one, casual player is white, one of the higher rateds in the event. At least, again, the rating doesn't mean that much because a lot of them are unrated. So in this game, it looks like black has these very strong pawns. I'm curious how this happened. So it was an exchange French, and white's just playing very simply, developing pieces. Black is kind of doing the same. But black's the one who plays more aggressively here. With knight going to e4. Notice how white lost some time also by doing this, and then takes. So this is the kind of thing that can get you into trouble seemingly from out of nowhere. Because in this position, if you just castle, or play h3, or do something like this, you're kind of playing normally. This is not a bad way to play. But if you do this, you have to be careful, because here, if you take, you've actually just lost 2 tempi. And even in a position with like an exchange French, which is a relatively safe structure for both sides, losing 2 tempi is a big deal. So I would say that this is probably not a wise decision by white. And now with f5 coming in, I really like this idea. Trying to put the pawn on f4, I think this is just really problematic. The pawn on f4 just looks like it's going to be so nasty. So white plays here. I mean, I would even consider trying moves like trying to, like f3, of course, f4 is bad, but something like f4, just trying to stop up those pawns. If takes, queen takes, I don't think there's any tactics on the bishop. And f4 is a very hard move to play because you are allowing this really beautiful pawn structure for black, but sometimes the pawns pushing is even more of a threat. So I think after here, already it's a difficult position. He grabs the bishop, but honestly, I don't know how much that helps. And here I think white's just going to get horribly attacked. Because these pawns are so strong, f3 is in the air. Probably white has to play f3 themselves. And after here, just bite the bullet and bring the bishop back, because the idea of black playing f3 just looks so powerful. So white does indeed do this, e3, and then g5. So here, It's just one of those positions that can be really difficult to play, but I would say that black has to be a little careful. If white gets the bishop out, so the white does something I really like, and maybe black shouldn't have allowed it. Like g5 doesn't seem necessary to me. Like I would consider even a move like rook here, or maybe just fixing this knight. This knight's not doing a lot. I would consider rerouting the knight somewhere a little bit better. Maybe from e7 it can go to f5, maybe to d5. But by doing this, you allow this, and now this bishop, which previously was not so great, has a beautiful square on c3, and you'll notice the black's own king is actually not that amazing. I still like black's position kind of, but I would say that it's all of a sudden become really unclear. So white's done a really great job regrouping. I think this idea was really nice. So why don't we stick with this game? I think it has the potential to really heat up and have a lot of action. So what else have we got here? Yeah, probably the queen should move here. And again, black's idea is actually like, it's funny because this bishop looks very strong, but just by itself it's not going to do that much. So probably black should just be trying to shove on the king side where the advantage lies. So something like queen here, maybe just playing here. Black decides to play this, which is a little surprising. So obviously white has to be careful. Maybe a move like king h1 is kind of prudent at some point, just so this queen can move. Because obviously you don't want to walk into this check normally. Although even here, the funny thing is after queen d3, e2 check, there is this move. So white decides to do it this way instead. Which is also quite reasonable, I would say. But the idea is the queen wants to move here where it's going to kind of put a little pressure on black's position and kind of say, you're not the only one with the threats, my guy. But definitely very double-edged. c6 is a move I don't like. I don't like cutting your queen off. I believe that the queen is just better on the king side to keep safeguarding the pawns, to kind of keep everything nice. I think a move like c6 asks for trouble. And I think after a move like queen d3, I'm already starting to like white. I don't like taking, though. I thought after queen d3, though, because if check, the king can simply move. And the problem is that after queen d3, the knight can't really move either because you're threatening just to come in. So black would have to play a move like this, and then you can even consider moves like d6 sometimes. Maybe not immediately because of here, and probably the pawn's too weak. You can consider ideas like b4, which not only tries to do this, but puts the bishop back and then tries to get the queen in. So I would say that c6 is just the type of move which I find very dangerous. So takes, the rook comes over. This is also a very logical way of playing, and I guess white's trying to use the d5 square as well. So a very tense battle. But I feel like white, even though they started off on the back foot by the tempo loss in the opening, is really outplaying black a little here. This knight h4 move I also don't care for, and the main reason is because it doesn't really do that much. And it's out of the game, and I feel like if white consolidates... So b3 is a very slow move, although it's probably not bad. But I much prefer trying to play rook d5 and then trying to activate the queen. And I feel like if you achieve all that, it's just going to be bad business. So black's playing g4, trying to get counterplay. This is understandable, but this can also seriously backfire because keep in mind your own king is quite weak. So if I play something like rook d5 here, even if we trade these pawns, my own king is open. But after I play here, you might find that the black king on g8 is actually even worse. So I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but I would say that like black's king is likely to be just as weak. But I definitely understand this approach, although it's definitely part of why in this position I definitely prefer playing rook here, because I feel like that just cuts off all of black's ideas, and white probably is going to be pretty dominant in a position like that. After b3, g4, let us see. So rook d5 played as kind of predicted. d5 played as kind of Sorry, I just realized I didn't actually have the YouTube chat open. So yeah, guys, I'm doing so I just opened the chat. Hey everyone. For some reason I forgot that I was on YouTube. There's a chat, so that's my bad. But anyway, I think this is a closed event, so I don't believe that there's access to the tournament. As far as challenging me goes, today I'm doing commentary for this event, but you'll definitely have other attempts to do that. Hey, Davina. In any case, so Yeah, king h1, rook g1 I think is coming, and again I think the black king is going to find it's a little bit weaker. Like in this position I think black has to be very careful already. Maybe something like some defensive posture like this, and then maybe trying to double rooks. The problem is that even there you're not secure, because after this queen d3, rook here, the king here is not safe either. But I think that b5 is just too slow, and then king h1 is going to be just really, really nice, followed by rook check, and I think that black's own king is just going to be way too weak for this position. Yep, king h1 played. Yeah, so feel free to follow along and definitely ask me questions. I am taking out the YouTube chat now for some reason. I didn't have it open. It's a bit of a brain meltdown, but you know, these things happen. So yeah, I think that rook g1 is going to be really, really strong here. So probably black has to try something like rook e6 to g6. But I don't believe it should hold. But I think it's the only attempt now, because if you allow rook g1 check by itself, I think it's just going to be too powerful. I am not drinking beer, I'm drinking iced tea. But between this commentary, the one I did earlier, and then another show I'm doing, and then a 2-hour lesson with a GM of all things, at the end of the day, there's definitely a beer in my future. So I'm looking forward to that. But for now, it's just iced tea. In any case, I think rook g1 is going to be very strong. And actually, in this position, this is an example of playing too fast. Rook g1 check probably is just good to have, because if you play this, then I have check, you can't block with a knight, and if rook king here, you can maybe check anyway, and if king here, then you can take back if you want, and it's probably a little bit better, because after this you do allow rook e6, which was played in the game. So this was an example where I actually think that taking a moment to not just recapture would have been a really strong idea, because now at least rook g6, and there's at least black's fighting and defending. So good resiliency by black here, I would say. Definitely not Budweiser, not happening. It'll probably be a Belgian beer that's very strong and very tasty. But that's not until like way later. So rook takes g6 and rook e7. Looks pretty good. But still actually not so simple. There's always this check in the air. And I'd say that white's own king is never perfect. So it's one of those things where if black hadn't achieved this amazing thing in the opening by getting the pawn to e3, black would just be hosed here. But because black has the structure kind of holding white at bay, there's at least something. I have to say though, I'm still not exactly sure what's going on. Maybe the best is actually to take and then even withdraw the rook with the idea of playing rook g1, because rook g1 is just going to be so nasty. White goes with something else entirely. This is a very counterintuitive move to me because the bishop was so beautiful on the long diagonal. But I'm assuming the idea is you want to basically make this knight feel uncomfortable about its life, which seems kind of rude, honestly. But it makes sense, right? Because this knight is a little bit annoying. But in general, I definitely prefer to take the rook on g6 and maybe retreat with the rook and try to target black's king. Keep in mind, the bishop on c3 is just quite good. So king takes g1. Yeah, so here it's kind of difficult to suggest great moves. He just goes back, which probably makes sense. So the question is, can white just regroup and play bishop here, queen here? I would say so. Moves like queen d3 immediately are also quite dangerous with the idea of playing rook d6. I kind of like that, actually, because I like creating threats whenever I can, right? Immediate threats. And this creates the threat of rook d6, which definitely looks pretty hard to parry, right? Like, it's just a really strong idea. So what else we got here? So what do we have? Knight back, king h1. Okay. So white just gets the king off the g file. This is also reasonable. But it does give black a move to maybe activate the rook. That's maybe the one drawback to playing this way. So rook d4. Again, this feels rather defensive, right? Like you could play queen d3 hitting this knight, and I think that that would be probably a little bit better. Yeah, queen d3 I really like, with the idea of rook d6. I actually don't know the average age of the competition. You'll have to ask. The club probably has that information, but I definitely am not fully aware. But yeah, rook d4, queen c5. Yeah, again, just passive moves in general I just don't like in positions like this. I feel like you want to play actively and go after black's king. Yeah, so this is a bit too defensive for my taste. The rook kind of controls the knight, but I feel like you're not also hitting black's king. So I definitely think that black is totally back in this game if they are on the ball here. So for black, I'd be looking to activate my own forces. So something like rook b8 with ideas of rook b1. Queen f5 is a nice move because you hit the rook and you also guard the knight. Hitting the rook is not so important. It's more that just you secure your position. So now, for example, ideas like bringing the rook to the back rank are actually potentially nasty. So queen g2. So now black actually has to be careful because sometimes there are ideas like rook takes f4 and queen takes knight. I don't know. Yeah, I think it works now actually. So you already have to be careful of this. So maybe a move like king h7 just getting off the g file is good. The problem white would have though is that, yeah, king f7 is also possible. And the problem is this queen on g2 is actually just really bad now. It's very passive. So if black gets a rook into the game, again, the tables can turn in a position like this very quickly. But notice how before I think white was doing well with the queen here, with the rook coming into the 7th, with the rook on the this file, with the bishop here. But notice how a few passive moves can kind of change the evaluation of the position, because now I would say at the very least it's an unclear position, and a lot of this is largely due to the fact that white's pieces are more passive now. So yeah, I don't know if bishop b4 really threatens that much for white. I saw that suggestion somewhere. So black actually just totally ignores white. But this queen h3, because you're hitting two things, you're threatening mate in 1 and also takes an f3, it's definitely a nasty type of move. You do allow this check, but this check may not do that much. Maybe you just go back to g8 and claim that these two threats are greater, which may not be incorrect. I suppose white can play a move like this, but then, because you can't take this pawn because of the hanging rook on c8, but it still looks a little bit flimsy to me. So yeah, this is already very, very dangerous, I'd say, for white. It's weird because black's king's so open, but because the pieces are more passive now, it's very difficult. Also, hello, Maria. And let me see. So queen e2. So white decides to just guard against both threats. But again, with the queen on a more passive square, it enables black to kind of activate. The question is, how do you take advantage of this, right? It's maybe not so simple because your own king is kind of in the open. That's why I kind of wanted to keep it here. So black decides to try to trade rooks. So I think the rook trade probably is decent for black because I feel like this queen with the weakness on f3 and the back rank could be pretty annoying. So white could definitely consider avoiding it, but it's also, that could also be dangerous. Like, you have to be very careful. So this is b7. So yeah, queen b7 check was definitely possible, but after king g8, the white's king is definitely weak, right? So you have to be careful. Yeah, here I'm assuming rook d4 maybe is actually a decent idea because I feel like with the rooks on the board, it's going to be harder for black to do a lot. He goes for it. This makes sense. Because now ideas like knight e5 always run into rook takes f4, so it makes it harder for black to do anything. And I think it's very important that white, as soon as they can, start pushing this pawn, because first of all, it gives options for queen c4 and ideas like that. But also it just creates counterplay. So knight e5 allowing rook takes f4, maybe it's a blunder? It doesn't look like you should allow this though. I'm guessing he missed that this pawn was hanging with check in addition. So this definitely looks like something that went wrong. So probably the king has to go this way, and then I like very much maybe a move like rook e4, just pinning the knight, and then you target the e-pawn. I think this was a bad blunder by white here. So we'll see. So the king goes to g7. Yeah, I mean, lots of options. Pinning the knight is definitely very logical with the bishop as well. I definitely like this approach. Hoping for queen takes e3. Maybe. I don't know. The thing with queen takes e3 is that even there, it's not so clear, right? But yeah, I think it's wise not to try to take that pawn. I really like this bishop c3 move, just pinning the knight. I think it makes a lot of sense. Well, there's a knight, there's a rook covering the f3 pawn, so it's going to be harder. As far as well, queen check, king here. I assume you mean queen d5, but I think the king was just running. Like, I don't think you were actually helping your position all that much, because there was still going to be a threat of this. So anyway, but this looks quite good for white. I would say that black's probably lost here. Because now the open king is just really going to hurt you as well, and I think that after a move like this, you're going to just be pinned up. And it's very hard to create threats for yourself. That's the problem. Like, the back rank's the only time you could do it. But let's say, for example, even if you get in this, if I take a knight and then just block with my bishop, I still think you don't have anything. So king g8 was played, and yeah, I mean, obviously you could trade queens, and the endgame's probably decent, but you still have this e-pawn, so a move like rook e4 might be a bit wiser. Just pinning the knight first. White takes, which maybe is okay, but it would not be my first choice. I mean, to give up this beautiful bishop for a knight that's just pinned to death. I would say that when people are up material, because people are taught to simplify so much, this is a huge pet peeve of mine. I'll probably mention it many times, which is that they just want to trade off everything. They're like, oh, I'm up a pawn, I want to trade. But the fact is that you don't want to trade your great pieces for your opponents, which are in trouble. And this knight is such a problematic piece for black, because you can just pin it to death. So I hate trading off pieces that are in trouble and doing things like this. I feel like you're doing a service to your opponent. So I understand that white's trading and is going to claim that they're up a pawn, but I feel like if you trade off your opponent's worst pieces, especially a queen endgame like this with the white king so passive, this pawn potentially dangerous, I feel like this is a good way to ask for trouble and to make the win way harder. And in fact, now I would say the position is just unclear. Because again, this king is just so much worse. Black's king is nice and open. So this is the c4 square, so I don't know what you're talking about, but yeah, I would say that in general, though, you should not take knights like this. When you have your opponent pinned up, it's really tough. And yeah, I would agree with that, St. Louis. Like, now all of a sudden it actually is risky. Like, I could easily see black winning this game, which I think that if you had left the knight pinned would be almost impossible. Yeah. But I really, really dislike this approach. So queen d1, though, looks like a nice move, because now you at least have this check, and you're still guarding the key entry squares for black. But even here, even if you get in queen d6, I would say it's not so clear. So now you have a queen trade you have to calculate. So if here, takes, king here, oops, king here, king here, king here, king here, pawn. You also had e2, and then takes. At the very least, black's not worse, let me tell you that. But okay, you always have to calculate it. So yeah, probably queen d3 makes sense. So now you're trying to go after this pawn. But it's still outrageously complicated. Even moves like queen here are possible, with the idea that if you take the pawn, I check, and I at least have a perpetual. Probably I have to take the perpetual. But queen f6 actually is an interesting option in a position like that. Well, I don't think it's an easy win if you trade off on d6, Samarth, because you lose one of your pawns back. And in this position, it's definitely not easy to trade queen, so I don't know if I quite agree with that. But I think that white's maybe on top again, because this king is now better. When the king was back here, it was really kind of a poor situation for the king. This is still really difficult to ever win. Like, I'm not so sure you can actually win this, but I would say that your chances are a little bit better. Yeah, here, even if you just start pushing this pawn, I'd say that it's very, very difficult for white to actually win a position like this. Because the king is so open, because these pawns are weak. I actually don't even like the move e5. I think that you should actually try to advance your king maybe. Try to like put your queen on a better square. But honestly, these queen endings are so difficult to win. That I would suspect a draw is actually reasonably likely in this position. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can definitely push the pawn for black, but I also think that checking is kind of annoying because the white king doesn't have like obvious shelter, I guess. Here, you can play to h4 and then you run out of checks. Which is one of the reasons why I don't like just checking mindlessly. Yeah, I don't know why he's not going to h4. Going to h4 makes sense. I guess you have to watch out for queen check. Take a5? Oh, is that the problem? Wow. That would be quite annoying. Wow. So they end up drawing. Okay, so really close game, guys. Really interesting game. And it's a Swiss event, so you have you're not going to have a bunch of games all going at once. It's not going to be like a an arena event where you have a side. So let's see what we have here. So this is it looks like Chess Logic against Sandro. Chess Logic is simply winning here. Yeah. So he's going to take this rook. Yeah, that's over. What else have we got? Is this the game? Yeah, this is with f5 checks. Sorry. For some reason, Lead Chess is not loading very well for me. I'm seeing like old positions and stuff. Okay, so what else have we got? Let me refresh this. Okay, so we have one game left, and that is this one. Yeah, this is a winning endgame. If you move the pawns over, you can't win because you end up stalemating. But because the king has this H file, this is not a stalemate position, which means the king can move. And here you just have to not queen. You can either play here and queen, or you could knight if you want to be super fancy about it. Here takes. I mean, it's hard to give a rating based on one game. I would say that game, like, it looked like between two very reasonable players. I would say, like, it was definitely a tough game. But I can't assign an exact rating. It's impossible off of one game, at least for me. Like, you have to see many, many games to do that, because everyone has variance, right? Especially young and improving players. So there are some games I'll have students where they look like, you know, say they're rated like 1600. There'll be games where they look like they're 2100, and then games where they look like they're 1200. So you can't really go by one game. But I would say that game looked like a pretty well played game. Just, I think that white got a bad opening, then outplayed their opponent, but then played a little bit too passively. So it looks like that's over for this round. So there's going to be a 30-second break, and then the next round will start. So as we saw, Jenna's 2007, Chess Logic, Josh, gotta root for him, obviously. 007, Aaron Sunboy, and Hockey 0430 all won. Prosman Hyper also. I think that was the bye, I want to say. And then there was a draw between St. Louis N7 and Casual Player, the game we went over. So let us see which game. So we want to go over, say, one of the people leading. Let's check out this game. Jenna's 2007 versus Hockey 0430. So in this one, looks like a pretty symmetrical position so far. Yeah, I mean, you get a lot of these games a lot from these kind of these sort of hybrid systems where both sides are kind of copying each other a little bit. But what I find about these symmetrical positions is that they're much harder to play than they look. Now, personally, as black, I prefer to be castled and have the option of knight c6, which maybe puts more pressure on the center in certain situations. Although the knight on d7 is not bad, just as an example. But I would say that there's lots of nuance. It's often who gets a knight to e5 or e4 first, who initiates play somewhere, who commits a queenside weakness, something like that. Yeah, they're definitely young. So I think middle school, like they said, middle school to high school, something like this. So a fairly large age range. As far as how to improve the game, I mean, for most people, you have to work on lots of tactics. So doing just tons of them. But I would say that that's a very general answer. Like everyone has their own thing they have to do. But I would say definitely playing slower time control games, looking over those games seriously. Doing lots of tactics, lots of puzzles, and just getting in a good amount of play as well. So there are so many things you can do to improve, right? Like you could ask anyone, they'll kind of tell you the same things, and honestly, there's no special answer. Like that's just the stuff you have to do. So yeah, so here, as I mentioned, because in this structure, it's who establishes their knight. So white's established the knight here. This is the typical for Stonewall setups. Now, I would say that establishing a knight here doesn't mean that you're just crushing or even that you have an advantage, but it does make your position easier to play. You have a bit more space. You have a clear plan that you can maybe play for an attack, either bringing the rook over, maybe bringing the queen over, and that black has to deal with your attack. You have a clear plan. And the problem black can have in a position like this is that oftentimes you don't have a clear plan, and it makes it so that your life's more difficult. But you still have to be cautious. For example, after these moves, you have to make sure you've calculated the move c4. So white does go for the attack, but now the move c4 might actually prove annoying with the idea that on pawn takes, you probably have to sack the exchange, which is at least interesting, but it's definitely not clear. And of course, you don't want to move back and allow the move c3. So I would say white doesn't really want to give up this knight, like unless you're checkmating with an idea like this. Like white wants to keep this knight. This knight's really annoying for black, so moving that knight I wouldn't really recommend. As far as openings go, I would say that I personally like at least sticking with a particular set of openings a little bit. I don't like playing just one system forever. I think that's a common mistake, and then people don't become very versatile. So I think you definitely want to mix it up a little bit, but I would say that a lot of players do the opposite, where they basically just learn every open, they try to play everything, and then they don't really learn anything deeply themselves. Like, they kind of can play everything, but they don't really know anything. And they also tend to study openings all the time, which I think is not really great for most players because you still have to learn how to play the rest of the game. So I think you want to strike a balance. You want to have a little bit of variety, but you want to give yourself time to get it. So let us see what's happening now. Yeah, so black, you can see that black actually has difficult decisions to make. I think in this position, a6 is just way too slow of a move. Because it's understandable you want to get your pawns going, but you don't have that much time. And now that this attack is kind of coming in, you have to be very careful. So I think this was the moment to really seriously consider c4, trying to break up black's position. I'm not saying this exchange sack type position is so clear, like takes. I think that white might have a lot of compensation. But I also think that like black had to try something like this, because you could also think about putting a knight on e4. I don't think that's stupid either, if you decided the exchange sack wasn't to your liking, or grabbing the exchange wasn't to your liking. So to answer your question, Rohit, I would say in this position, again, taking here, it opens up your bishop, but I'd say you only do it if you're going to win by force, because when you allow this, if you allow d4 opening up my bishop, all of a sudden the tables are turning on you. So you have to be very careful about making this capture. I would say you don't want to do it unless you have a forced continuation. But I think what white's going for very smartly is they're targeting this pawn instead. So if you have to play h6, then g4, g5 is probably going to wreck you. If you play g6, then your ideas of taking on c5 someday might be good with this open bishop. Maybe not immediately. But probably black has to try something like this. Black ended up going here. And now bishop takes h7 was played. And now it's going to be very, very difficult. Although I think there are some mistakes being made here. So in this position, after takes, maybe you should be taking this first, with the idea that on the recapture with either piece, you play queen h5, and then this knight can't move due to mate. So you're basically going to just take the knight next. And of course there's no mate, right? But it looks really, really devastating. Moves like rook takes h7 also could be considered, with the idea that on king takes, you go here, you take. Obviously, you have at least a draw. Maybe you only have a draw there, in which case you probably should go for more. But these are, like, this position, I would give you this as an example of a position where I would spend a good amount of time as white. Because you're about to, like, take and crash through and maybe win. So if you spend a couple extra minutes and play it accurately, I think that it's going to be really important. So whether you take here first, whether you take here first, whether you go for one of these sacks, like, it's such an important moment that you want to spend that time to make sure you get it right. Because this, I'm not so sure about, because now knight f6, and I'm guessing they missed this, that not only are you defending the knight, you're defending this pawn as well. I'm guessing that white banked on the fact that this is a double attack. But this move is also a double defense, I guess you could call it. Doing this and then defending. And now all of a sudden it's not so clear. Yes, you still have an attack, but you're also down a piece. And being down a piece doesn't make your life any easier. But I would still say that you have a very strong attacking potential here, and it's a very dangerous position for the black pieces. Yeah, I mean, rook g3 is possible, but then you're not putting any pressure on here, right? So you don't have any bishop takes h7. I think that rook h3 is the right idea. I know this because I've seen so many stonewalls. That I've seen this attack happen many, many, many times. That it was the correct idea, it just wasn't executed well. I think that white should have taken a moment here to figure out whether you take. I think both those options are extremely promising. Taking is probably the safest though. Taking d7 and then just queen out here, and I think that you're just forcing your opponent to pitch that knight, and you're just going to be up a pawn with an attack. So I think that that's the safest route. Or the simplest, I would say. Queen here. So yeah, the knight on d2 can try to get in the game, but it still takes time. So black takes here, white takes back, and black grabs a pawn. Now sometimes grabbing a pawn actually helps you defend, because this queen actually helps defend the knight a little bit. So maybe this move is actually quite reasonable. I would always be nervous about taking a pawn like this, but sometimes to get counterplay, you actually have to grab these risky pawns and just say, look, you at least have to prove something now. So I think that white should maybe consider bringing this knight in, which I think was suggested by one of you. It definitely makes a lot of sense to me. I don't really see another course of action that makes a lot of sense. You could try g4, g5, trying to put pressure on the knight this way. And I don't know. I mean, it looks like a very difficult situation for black, because it's really hard to... The thing is with these knights that they're kind of sturdy, but they're also like... You can't move anything. Like, you can't try to move... You can't ever move this knight because you get mated. You can't move this knight because this guy's going to hang in most cases. Now, with the queen here, maybe you have an opportunity, but it's going to be difficult. And I just say that in general, this makes life kind of difficult for you, you know? So I don't know. I would say that these knights make your life hard. So even though whites maybe played this inaccurately, I still think their attack is very dangerous. But I definitely like, yeah, so retreating, I don't know. I mean, I definitely like bringing this knight into the game. His idea, though, I think, is he wants to take this while he has the chance. The problem might be a move like bishop e7, trying to guard against that. Because notice how if you take here and I take, the queen still guards. That's why the beauty of this pawn grab was that you actually guard against this. But maybe bishop here, you could even think about e4 with the idea of taking this knight then, cutting off the queen. So plenty of options. So bishop c5. Maybe, I mean, like the main thing though is you want to crack at these pieces, right? So he plays bishop here immediately. So takes, and I'm assuming, so queen h4, so the idea, queen h6, sorry, the idea of this is to throw in this check. And this looks like a very, very powerful idea indeed. So I'm wondering how black defends against this. The problem is you are kind of all in. So queen g6 allows rook here, and this, at the very least, white wins the piece back, although the game is far from over. One other option, by the way, here, was you could even try taking this and then maybe putting your bishop here just to interfere with the rook. That's sometimes a common way to try to defend. and you're just relying on this queen's defense along this diagonal. So definitely plenty of options. Queen g6 gives back the material, but also black's made a lot of headway, and now you're really glad you took this pawn. So knight g5, and I'm wondering if here white played a little too hasty, because white just took this queen, but you also have the opportunity to bring the queen back here. And maybe this actually makes sense as well. I guess you still have bishop takes e3. I feel like white should not have allowed any of this. Like allowing takes on e3 is going to be at least give black some resources. But I really would want to keep the queens on. I feel like once you trade the queens, blacks all have good chances. I guess you could take like this and then take the queen this way. Might be also possible. But he goes for this, and yeah, I don't know. It feels like the two bishops here are very, very strong. I would definitely consider playing f5 to not allow all these pieces into the game. You also have a pawn hanging here, which probably could be taken. So I have the feeling actually that like both sides forgot about this pawn hanging. Because I think taking this pawn and then playing a move like f5, something like this looks quite good to me. I don't really see an issue with this. So takes here. Takes bishop back, takes rook d6. Yeah, I mean, it's still a very complicated position, but I think material's even, and the two bishops are pretty good in positions like this, usually. But black's king is also not so clear. I think if you had taken this pawn, though, black would just be much better. Here, king up. So I don't know. Here, I would definitely consider also moves like knight e5, trying to target this pawn. Because if you force it up, then you can maybe bring the other knight in, maybe try h4. I'm not exactly have the inside track on all this stuff, Graham, so I don't know. I wouldn't ask me about Singfield Cup type questions, things like that. Definitely, the club can probably answer these questions far better than I can. So I don't know. It's but I would say that it would be cool if certain things could happen, but at the moment it's just everything's up in the air, right? So rook c1, rook c8, takes, knight e5. G5. So again, it's kind of an unclear endgame. So these guys are playing a really interesting game. I feel like though the opening, like after the opening with the stone wall and bishop h7, if white had played a little bit more carefully, they would have just won. But black also had to be very resourceful, because even after the blunder, it still was so dangerous, and black really found a lot of resources here. So knight f3. So trying to target this g5 pawn makes a lot of sense. Defends. Now you might have thought about trying to defend this way. First of all, you don't allow this, but also you don't allow yourself to be pinned. So for example, after here h4, you can simply take it. But this also is not unreasonable. So here black plays bishop f6. The thing is, you'd love to play this, getting the rook in, but you have to deal with this fork. So the move bishop f6 makes a lot of sense. Here, and now king h5. So you have to be careful. Kings like this can get mated sometimes, but they also can be quite decent. Alright, see, I knew these guys would have answers for you. So, knight goes to f3. I don't know, honestly, here. This is just such a messy position. There's so much going on. As black, I'd be really tempted to activate this rook, though. So, for example, rook c6 to c2 would be something very tempting for me. Whereas as white, this rook looks very awkward to me. So I'd want to be able to play like something like knight h7 or knight f7 and bring the rook here. And then if you can start launching these pawns, this could be really, really bad for black. So I actually think that this whole idea of allowing white to take could be very dangerous. But the question is what to do here. Like this, I think, is coming. So black does go for this, which looks really reasonable. But I would be very worried about this type of thing. So I guess maybe here you can take because of the pin. Definitely looks very flimsy though. I'd be very, very worried here. Yeah, we got Tracy on the ball with information, guys. So yeah, definitely feel free to obviously ask me about the chess position and stuff like that. But as far as information on the players and as far as information about club events, definitely I am not the one to ask. But definitely you can ask in the chat because we do have Tracy here and we have the person manning the St. Louis Chess Club account as well. So I'm sure they have all the info. So yeah, I don't know. This is already kind of weird. Like, but definitely you want to fix this rook, right? Like to me, if this rook was to become active, white would just be winning. So I'd be definitely tempted by moves like this. The question is, can black get away with taking? It looks so sketchy, and maybe I'm just missing something. So my idea, oh no, you can't, because if knight takes, okay, if you check, then king here, then you can't take because of mate, which is really hilarious. So just to give you an idea, after here takes, so maybe you take back immediately, and then this isn't mate because you have this square, but it looks so sketchy, like there has to be something. Maybe there isn't, you know? Sometimes there are these things that look really messed up, but so 91 actually makes sense. So you're trying to cover the c2 square, but then you can also try to reroute your knight in this way. But I guess black can also try to block you from doing that. So moves like e5 and trying to put the bishop on f5 could be quite nasty. Yep, so black goes for it. So yeah, if knight d3, you have moves like bishop f5, you have bishop g4, you have rook c2 check. So I feel like knight e1 is kind of a step in the wrong direction. But again, the main thing is just I want to fix this rook. This rook is just blocking all of white's play. So really interesting endgame, really interesting position. So I'm kind of hesitant to switch from it just because there's so much going on here. Yeah, again, like I don't like switching a lot in general when I do commentary. A lot of people do it differently. But especially if a game's interesting, I hate kind of switching away from it. So I'm gonna stick to this for now. But obviously, like there are plenty of there are other games going. Yeah, I'm kind of curious what happens after e5, honestly. Like this pawn coming up, like if the pawn lands here, even this knight might just be dead. So it feels like white has to maybe move that knight, but then you have to watch out for check. You have to watch out for bishop here. I think this 91 move was maybe just not the best. So this knight went back. Interesting. So these knights all of a sudden look kind of sad. But at the same time, sometimes you can't take advantage. So here I very much like the move bishop g4 because it cuts off the rook and it puts pressure on the knights. Like the knight, and then there's just no moves. Black goes with e4 instead, which is more forceful. But the thing is, I thought that knight d4 was at least a move now. So you can't just take on h4 and just be winning. But I feel like the move bishop g4 would just be like so nasty because then I'm threatening to take in some positions, I'm threatening e4, and you just have no moves at all. So it just makes your life very difficult. So e4 knight d4. Which is pretty forced because otherwise the h4 pawn drops with the pin. So here probably you should not simplify and trade. In general, I think that that's probably the wrong approach. You want to keep your two bishops, which are so strong. So the only question is where you want to go. You can play a move like rook c1. You can play rook c3. The problem with positions like this is often that you have too many options. So rook c1, rook c3 are definitely high on my list. Rook c7 is also quite playable, I think. But yeah, it's amazing how strong these pieces are. So it just, piece play matters so much. White had these knights here, and if white had tried to get the rook in and tried to push the pawn, I think that it would have been quite promising. But as things are, I think that black's starting to take over the game. Definitely a lot of options here. Black goes for rook c3. I like this move. Targeting pawns, stuff like that. Yeah, white's rook is having issues here, yeah. However, maybe rook here now is a valid option. You give away the pawn with check, but then you play here, then you bring the knight in. Oops, knights don't move like that, Josh. So I don't know, I think maybe rook here. Like white has to get active though. If white stays passive, I think the position is just death. So I think that white has to play very actively here to try to have a chance in this game. Because again, I think black should have leaped at the chance to cut off the rook earlier rather than playing e4 too fast. So king e2 is played instead, but now I feel like you're walking into this move. And if king d2, you can simply retreat with the rook. Also, you're walking into bishop takes c3 here. In fact, this probably just wins, because if rook g5 check, you take. That's the key. and that's a lot hanging. So it seems like white fell apart a little bit. I would say that this move would have kept white in the game for sure, with the idea of g3 and then fixing this knight. You basically, every position I just want to fix pieces is what you'll notice. But white played king e2, leaving the rook undefended, and I believe now it is simply losing. If you go here, I can simply move my bishop back somewhere. If you play check, I take, and then your rook still hangs. It's very important, of course, after check, you don't go back and then allow takes. So I think it's just losing now. We'll check back on this game, but I would say it looks lost. So maybe, yeah, so here, let's just make sure he takes. Yeah. And then he takes here. Yeah, it should be winning. So we can check back on this to make sure the game was won, but let us maybe switch to another game. Let's see. So let's check out chess logic. Okay. So this game, let's just do a brief recap of what happened. So this was a King's Indian with bishop g5. By the way, these systems are not so easy to face. They're one of those where people underestimate them a lot, I think. So black goes for this. So this is very consistent to me. So black played knight a6, c5, which is one of the common ideas. But they did it in two moves. They played here and here. And costing yourself tempi tends not to work. Whereas white's just playing all very natural moves. Probably this is unnecessary. Probably you can just play rook d1 or even just castles. So it's probably overly safe. But definitely this position is looking reasonably good for white now. But guys, nothing too crazy yet. So takes. Queen, bishop out. And then here he, I don't know, some weird stuff. Yeah, b5 though I think is too much. I would say that pawns like this actually tend to be underestimated. People see a pawn structure like this and they think of it as crippled, but the fact is these pawns run together really well and they control lots of squares and they're not weak. Like you'll notice after a4, these pawns are just so nasty because they're they just stay together and they're impossible to attack. So this kind of structure, I would say, is easily underestimated in my experience. So I would definitely not sacrifice a pawn in order to give white that structure. I would say that you're passive here, it's a difficult position. But you probably have to play it patient and try to trade pieces. So for example, moves like knight e4 come to my mind. Trying to be active, trying to open up the bishop, and trying to swap some pieces so that your white's extra space is not quite as significant. So black does blockade the square, which is quite nice. But I would say that these pawns, that's a pretty clear extra pawn. So I would be very happy to be white here. So black tries to get counterplay, which I can appreciate. The problem is that I don't know if you're actually going to get there. And now the knight's really passive. Probably here you could at least think about taking and trying to activate the knight. I'm also not sure retreating was the wisest course of action, although it's kind of understandable, I guess. But yeah, this looks actually just very painful because I think that these pawns are just so solid. You can see it, right? And they make black's life really miserable. You can even put a rook here and things just start to get really nasty. So he played h3, queen there. Yeah, I mean, positionally, there are lots of options here. Honestly, like the idea of putting the rook here and doubling looks just so, ugh. I would hate to be black here. It's just such a difficult position to play, but it's why you don't allow this. So queen e3 was played instead, and then knight e8, but this is obviously also, yeah, rook summons to c6. And now I think it's really a matter of technique for white, how they convert it. So obviously you don't want to give up this pawn, so doubling rooks would be a little too hasty, but you have so many options here. I definitely like the idea of maybe solidifying this pawn somehow. Even a move like queen b3 so that you can maybe bring this knight in, that you can maybe start pushing. Even pushing this pawn I don't think is too hasty because this bishop controls this pawn so nicely. So even just starting to push your pawns looks pretty good. But I would say that this is just a really tough position for black to play. Yeah, I'm kind of curious what white chooses because we're getting to the point in the game where neither of them have tons of time. And keep in mind, this is no increment at all. And I understand why they do this because it's obviously easier to predict when the rounds end, and otherwise without increment it can go forever. But the fact is that with no increment, it gets kind of dicey around the end of the game. So you end up with under a minute, you're really blitzing it out. So even if you play lots of bullet, it's it can get kind of rough around the end of the game. So while I'd say neither side is in danger of flagging just yet, it's still very difficult. So white goes with a5, which is an approach I don't mind at all. Sometimes if you're in doubt about how you should approach a position and you're looking for a solid move but nothing comes to mind, sometimes just pushing your pawns is good. Just don't overthink it. Because a lot of the times you just push your extra pawns and they become dangerous, right? So someone mentions bishop e4. I definitely think this is a reasonable trying to at least target this pawn. So then here maybe queen comes out here to try to defend. He goes with bishop c4, which is also a move. But yeah, as I was saying, sometimes you just want to push your pawns because there are times when you want to be more fancy. There are times when you want to be like, okay, I want to be super precise, not allow counterplay, do all of that. But a lot of the times, the way to do that is you simply push those guys. And it just becomes really annoying to deal with. So black tries to a little harassment, trying to take that pawn. Ooh, so they allow him to take. I don't know if you're supposed to do that, although it still looks very nasty because you can actually take and then take here at the end. Which looks pretty good because that b pawn is going to be very strong. And if queen c1 check, you can always play knight f1, and that's actually fairly solid. So even though you're technically losing a pawn probably because this guy hangs, I think this b pawn just ends up queening. So probably this was not necessary, but we're coming to the end of the game now where things are really, really heating up. So really, really exciting. Black just resigns. Okay. Oh, they hung a queen. Oh, they thought this was the only legal move, so they pre-moved. Oh, nasty. But to be fair, after knight here, I guess knight here though, it's still not over, but oh, you can take this pawn and guard against the threat. Yeah, probably still winning. So let's see. So there's one game left. And oh man, poor white. They're down to 4 seconds and they're down to rook. I think this is over. Oh man, they even let him take. That's still 2 bishops and lots of pawns. So as long as black doesn't mess this one up, I think it's going to be over. Yeah, you have many ways to go about it. But white's not flagging. This is impressive play. Ah, but now you queen. Yeah, so that should end it. All right, so then the next round, so the leaders currently Chess Logic, J Josh, go Josh, and Hakio 4-3-0. I'm gonna take a very quick bathroom break before the next round. I'll be back in a second. All right. Let us see. So, in the midst of round 3 now, let me try to find an interesting one. So currently Hockey and Chess Logic are in the lead. So why don't we check out their game, because they're currently leading. So e4, c6, we have a Caro. Yeah, bishop e6 here is a little bit unusual. Most people play either knight c6 or here. I'm wondering if they got confused, because there's a line that goes knight c6, bishop g5, and then bishop e6. But playing bishop e6 here feels quite artificial to me. Like, the bishop here just doesn't really belong. Against bishop g5 in particular, it makes sense, because often after takes, you can actually justify the bishop here, even though it's a little bit weird. But I would say that in this particular position, it's definitely a little bit odd looking to me. Maybe it's a move and I'm just unaware of it, but for example, moves like queen b3 come to mind, where trying to sort of punish this and target this pawn definitely come to mind. But white decides just to take and play here, which maybe is all right also. Here, bishop e2. So this is a little bit, again, you're kind of not punishing your opponents. I mean, I would at least consider bishop b5 check. Trying, and maybe knight e5 or moves like knight g5 in some positions. Like, sometimes your opponent plays a move like this, and it's, if you give them enough time, it just becomes a fine normal move. So sometimes you have to think about punishing them a little bit earlier. So I would definitely kind of consider ideas like that for sure. So here, in fact, white does play queen b3, and now it's definitely a large think. Playing it here was an interesting choice, though, because it feels like black's ready to castle now, which is not ideal for taking this pawn. So I definitely don't agree with white's choice of kind of simple move and then trying to take advantage. I think queen b3 earlier, when black was less developed, could have been more potent. Playing it here, of course, is possible. So now there are lots of options. Black can definitely take this knight. I don't see any reason not to, because if you try to take this pawn, I can play bishop d5. Hitting your queen, defending my rook, and then I can move my knight next. So that would be actually just a blunder. So after knight takes knight, you have to take with a queen, which, to my mind, doesn't look all that natural. So black plays knight b6 instead, which is also reasonable looking, I suppose. The queen can move back and then castles knight c6. So I feel like black really got let off the hook here, because black's position is totally normal now. But I think that if white had played a little bit more punishing, they could have made this move feel a little awkward. Because as it is now, it seems like black's just doing fine. You can play knight c6, hit this pawn, give it castle, and you can claim that the bishop on e6 makes sense, because you're maybe supporting knight c4 ideas, you're supporting bishop c4 ideas. It's almost like a reverse Tarash, actually. Where black has the white in this case, white has the IQP, and black has the fianchetto bishop, is trying to play for the c4 square, the d5 square. So very much like a reverse Tarash. And because white's lost time with the queen, it may even be almost a transposition, because you're not even down a tempo for this, really. Normally there's actually a line that goes like this in the Tarash, but I suspect the knight on b6 may even be better. So I don't know. I think knight c6, bishop e3, and then maybe a move like knight c4. And I think already black's even playing for a slight advantage, although objectively it probably should be still somewhat close to equal, I want to say. But you have to be careful. After here, yeah, so after here, bishop e3, if you try knight c4, maybe d5 is an issue. Although even there's takes, and life becomes crazy. Takes. Probably you shouldn't allow this. I don't know. Looks a little nuts, but maybe it's playable. But you don't have to do this either. After here, you can play like this knight here is a perfectly fine move. You can play bishop here, trying to trade off the bishop instead. You can even just play a move like rook c8, just developing a piece and saying, okay, what exactly are you doing with your life? And I think that's a very valid question, actually. So even a move like rook c8, I just kind of like. I feel like it's just a useful move, and there's nothing really to indicate that black should really be worried about life. But yeah, I mean, you have knight d5, you have bishop c4, you have rook c8. You have so many nice moves. The key is actually to kind of find one you like and then pick it and not overthink the situation too much. But knight c4, if you want to play knight c4, you have to make sure d5 is not a good move. That's the one caveat. that if you try to play knight c4, you have to have it calculated out. In my case, I don't really like it. I think that it's unnecessary to allow this. I don't know. I do kind of like trading these bishops strategically, but I would also worry about some d5 moves. So I don't know. Moves like rook c8 are, it's kind of hard to go wrong with them. Moves like knight d5, like they're just so solid. But of course, the position is still relatively normal. You're just playing an IQP. Nothing tragic has happened really. But again, I think the key is, especially in shorter time controls, and I'm still including rapid and shorter time controls. No, don't overthink it. You just kind of want to play your moves, play nice and solid. Don't allow anything too crazy. And that's kind of the main deal with that. So let us see. Black still has yet to make a decision. Could take a brief look. I'll get back to this. I'm kind of curious if there's anything going on in the other games. It's worth noting. So the other one, Josh, my boy, is and like me, he's a fan of e4, e5. I have to root for my namesake, obviously. Sorry for my less than unbiased commentary. He even plays my line. He plays knight f6. I've always been a fan of knight f6 more than bishop c5, even though I have played both for sure. So d3, bishop c5, knight c3. Yeah, so this is kind of a typical. So again, I kind of like putting the bishop on e7, or even h6 systems are kind of interesting, but bishop c5, of course, is fine. Yeah, this is stuff you see, again, at scholastic level, you see this all the time. But then when you get to, you know, higher master levels and GM level, you almost never see it, this kind of position. Because people kind of know how to deal with it as black. It's not quite as potent. So h3, yeah, I mean, this is kind of common. A lot of people play bishop here, and then there's h6, g5 type stuff. I actually saw a game in the first Scholastic tournament today, which I did commentary on, that after bishop g5, there was a really exciting game with here, g5, and then the knight sack, which is a bit dubious, I think. And black actually won a really, really cool game. Very fast. But this is something I would say is dangerous. Like, in this kind of position, often you want to play h6 or some move like that, just so you don't allow this kind of thing. If you play castles and bishop g5, now, at the very least, this is just annoying. Like, maybe it's no big deal, maybe you're okay here. But when you have this pin, it's just really kind of nasty. And a move like a6, I think, is just too slow. And now you have to contend with moves like knight d5 all the time. So black goes for this. And now I guess you have to consider taking. So the main issue with taking is that you do allow knight takes d5. But these are lines you have to calculate. And calculate them well, I would say. Because these lines, because obviously if knight takes, you're just winning, right? Because the pin is too powerful. But after knight takes, the idea is usually, you want to do this. But now even here, you have to contend with moves like queen h5, for instance. And maybe there's queen f6, or something weird like that. Actually, I don't know. That's actually kind of sketchy. But, you know, you have to contend with queen h5 with the idea that on pawn takes, bishop takes, and your king is kind of weak. So I don't know, I would actually be, I mean, this is a serious move to consider, and I believe that maybe, I don't know how long Chess Fan thought here, but I would say that this was kind of a crucial position. So knight takes d5, g5 should definitely be considered. Bishop back to g3 instead was played, takes, king up. This is a common move, by the way, in these kind of positions. You want to sometimes play this, or even f6 just to solidify, get out of this pin. So very, very common idea. But you're noticing how a slow move like a6 is really felt in a position this sharp, right? When the position's this sharp, you got to play fast. You have to be very precise and not play any slow moves usually. So this game is also quite sharp. So yeah, these are the two games we have to keep an eye on, because this one definitely could heat up, but at the moment Josh is thinking. So let's see what happened in this game. F5 was played. So we'll definitely have to keep an eye on that game. That game looks like it's going to be very exciting. But okay, so we have this position. Bishop g4 was chosen. This move I don't like. And the main reason is because I feel like if you try to grab this pawn, first of all, this is a clear tempo loss, right? Because you have bishop e6, bishop g4, and I think that the bishop on e6 makes a lot of sense with this d5 square. And also you're allowing all sorts of stuff. Like here after h3, it's one thing. Sometimes you're allowing d5, and then after takes, bishop takes. Again, you're just kind of losing time a little bit. But h3, and the idea is that after takes, it looks like you're blundering a pawn, but because this always hangs, that's not the case. And again, you're kind of giving up the two bishops and allowing the position to be opened, which also is in general something I would not be a fan of. So I can't say I like this bishop g4 approach by chess logic. I think that they should have tried one of the moves I mentioned, either just rook c8, bishop c4, maybe knight d5, all of this. So definitely something I would mention. So let me go back to this game because I think that this is just going to be a much more exciting game from what I've seen. So c3, so black does play f5, and this queen d2 move I'm not a fan of because you're allowing f4. Usually in these situations after f5, it's an automatic move to just take this pawn. Now, you don't want to play it just on pure autopilot because there are times when you can't do this. But I think here in particular, you should absolutely take this pawn because then if bishop takes, you have all sorts of ways to try to play. You can try to castle kingside and then just sort of maneuver your knight around. You can try to castle queenside and then just try to open up the king, which is very open already. You can try to have castle and even d4 after you've got your king out of the center. Try to play d4 and open up the position that way. You have so many possibilities, but I would say allowing f4 is almost always a no-no because you end up with a bishop shut out of the game and it makes my king safer. I don't necessarily have to win anything. I just have to keep your bishop out of the game, and with a safe king, it should be really, really nasty. And it means that you castling kingside is almost always impossible. So I really dislike allowing the move f4, but it wasn't played, so I'm wondering if I'm just blundering something, or if these guys just have a different view of the position than I do somehow. But yeah, f4 is definitely in the air for me. I don't have to win the bishop to want to play f4. It makes my king safer, it shuts down the white bishop. I don't know where you mean b1 and then get the 7th rank exactly. Oh, you mean in the previous game, I see. Yeah, that's maybe possible. So knight e7. Yeah, I guess after knight e7 you can't stop f4 anyway, so maybe this makes sense. But you do allow moves like d4, which I think at least make the game a little bit messier, but maybe it's not a big deal. So instead the bishop goes back and now f4 is played. So black does indeed go for it. And here I think that Josh, I'm assuming it's a Josh, I'm hoping it's a Josh, has a pretty good position here. So you have to be a little cautious. Obviously the move d4 is still kind of nasty if you have to take, but I don't think you ever do. I think you can play knight g6. If d4, you can simply retreat because I don't think the trades are going to be helpful. At some point, you could think about queen f6 and maybe h4, h5, g4, trying to even restrict things further. But I would say the important thing in a position like this is you don't have to rush for that. You want to keep the game under control because with a bishop like this, as long as you don't allow your opponent too much counterplay, you should probably just be close to winning. So I think that the important thing for black is to kind of keep things sort of solid. But I think for white, allowing f4 is a really big mistake and not something I think they should do. Black plays for a5, a4, which is a very typical idea, but once again, I do not like allowing d4, because I feel like when these pawns get broken up and then white tries to go here, this bishop might see the light of day, you know? And one of the most important things when you do shut your opponent's bishop out is do not let it see the light of day. So I don't like allowing d4 when this pawn is a little bit looser. And the idea is that a pawn takes, you don't have to take with the pawn and allow bishop b4, of course. You can play here takes and take with the knight. And there's still the idea of h4. Maybe it's no big deal, but I would much prefer to not do that. White just plays a4, though. Is very respectful of this a4 push. This is not an open tournament, Manish. This is a closed tournament. Let me see. So bishop d7 played again. I don't like ignoring this move for black. I think that you should constantly kind of be aware of it and maybe just solidify your position like this to make sure that d4 you can keep things closed. Again, as long as you keep the position under control, this bishop is just really terrible. So bishop d7. Yeah, Rohit, that's a possible idea, that after takes, you can even think about f3 and getting the bishop out this way. But that's kind of my point, right? Like, you don't want to make it easier for your opponent to free up a piece like the bishop on h2. I would say it's so important to make sure that bishop stays hemmed out of the game. So definitely really interesting. We'll check out the other game to see how it's going. Again, I'm alternating between the two leaders of the tournament. Again, if I see a really interesting game going somewhere else, I might peek in. But for the most part, I'm going to stick to how the leaders are doing. So this game's progressing very slowly. So he actually just goes back. He basically admits his mistake completely, which, again, it looks kind of silly to play like this. But sometimes it's kind of the sign of a mature player that they can do this, because it's very difficult to admit playing a mistake during a game. And if you're able to say, you know what, I made a mistake, I'm going to go back, I think that's a really good thing. And black's position, of course, is completely fine still. So b3 is played. I don't really like b3 as a move in general. You're covering the square, but the weakness of the long diagonal tends to be really, really nasty in the long term. So I would say that I'd really prefer to do without a move like this. So I think white could have just, you know, again, taken a page out of black's book a little before and just improve pieces, right? Make pieces better. So b3, rook c8, rook c1, and now we're kind of just here. So I think that black's actually playing a little too slowly. They're clearly not so familiar with the position, and they're kind of just trying to figure out what to do, which explains this. But I would say the important thing here is that, especially in a 15-minute game, it's 15 moves and you've already used 2/3 of your time. You have to get moving. The good news is I really like this move for him, because I feel like if the bishop moves, then you have to deal with takes ideas. So maybe the bishop has to go to d2, but it's very passive there. So you're seeing this move b3 already haunting white, because if the pawn were back on b2, bishop g5 would be a good move. But because the pawn is on b3 with this knight loose, you have to probably defend it with something like this, maybe. So yeah, so I would say that this is already, like, black's still doing quite well. And again, I think this move is just not great. So white trades, which is sensible, but it does allow bishop here, and I think black's position has just become really easy. Keep in mind, when you're dealing with an IQP position, if the position simplifies too much, especially with minor pieces trading, the IQP just becomes a worse of a weakness the longer it goes. Because keep in mind, an IQP by itself is not necessarily that bad. It's just, it depends on the situation, and the more pieces get traded, the more things simplify, the more that pawn just becomes a weakness. Whereas if you have lots of pieces on the board and white's using their extra space that the isolated pawn gives them, it can even be an advantage to have it. So it really depends on the type of situation you're dealing with. But I would say that here, definitely the black's the one who's in the driver's seat as far as they have a comfortable position. However, time is going to become a factor. They have less than 5 minutes. Their opponent also, hockey, also doesn't have that much time. So I'd say this is going to be a pretty tense game. But we'll again check back on it. I don't think there's too much action going on. Let's check out this crazy game with the open king side. So yeah, here d4 was finally played and knight takes, which I think is a good decision. Again, note how you cannot take with the pawn due to bishop b4. But I don't even mind taking with the knight, because I feel like now you're going to get a lot of stuff. So here you're threatening knight takes d4, followed by bishop b4 again. So white has to contend with this in some way. You could think about even just taking this knight. You could think about knight e6. There are so many options here that it kind of makes it difficult to choose, honestly. He chooses just to castle. The problem with castling is that you're kind of castling into the fire here, because I think that these pawns are just so menacing now. And this game also, you notice both guys are taking their time. They're both under 5 minutes. Which again, in a 15-0 game is a serious business, right? Because you can just lose on time. But here I think the move knight e5 makes a lot of sense. And then it's just going to be tough for white, I think, because you have these kind of moves, like, even though it might free the bishop someday, f3 might just checkmate you at some point. And if you try to play f3 yourself, then first of all, you're walking into this pin, and also you're walking into this. So I'd say that a move like knight e5 just kind of calls to be played. And I think when you're low on time, you have to be somewhat practical. And if a move looks that solid and that nice, you probably should just play it and not overthink the position too much. Because I think that, you know, the more you overthink here, especially when you're getting low on time, the rougher it can be. But you have other options too. I mean, moves like queen f6 are definitely not poor, and they make a lot of sense. I would almost say like between knight e5 and queen f6 and maybe a couple other moves, it's more important to decide on one and play it quickly than actually think a long time here in a short time control game. Just because, again, like you just don't have that much time to worry about all these decisions, and it feels like these guys are agonizing over each of these decisions. I would say that it's very important when you're playing this kind of time control. You want to reserve your time for those key moments where it's really important you get the right move. And this is a mistake we all make. It's not like when I play, I perfectly manage my time, believe me. But I would say like a moment like this, you just should not be spending all your time. You should be thinking about queen here, knight here. There's no knockout blow. It's not like bishop takes h3 gives checkmate here. At least I don't think so. So it's like you really have to think about, okay, just improve my pieces. There we go, queen f6. I have no problem with the move. The only thing I have a problem with is he spent like 2 minutes on it or more. I think that that's just a risky thing to do. And now he has under 3 minutes for the rest of the game with no increment. And again, if later he has this decision to make that's not so easy, it's gonna be he's gonna miss that time. So I would say that here I like black's position. I think this bishop shut out of the game is really bad. I think that white has a weaker king, but I think the time situation by itself makes this game a lot closer. But white also has to be careful here because this is a move where if they're not careful, maybe they just end up just losing. So I don't know. I mean, my temptation is kind of to simplify the game, like try to take, maybe bring this rook out somewhere, or even think about bishop here, just trying to trade off those guys. I'd be nervous about trading, but I feel like if you buy yourself time to kind of do this, maybe you'll be okay in some future life. But honestly, I think white's situation is just really difficult. So it's not like I think they have an easy move. They play rook d1, which is perfectly sensible. But it also doesn't do that much, and I feel like after a move like knight e5, black's just doing extremely well here. But once again, black has to play quickly. Rook a e8 is also reasonable, trying to target this pawn. No problem with this move at all. Yeah, I mean, black's really just doing very well here. It's just the time that's the potential issue. So probably rook e1 is kind of a reasonable move. And maybe then f3, though, can come into play. I understand it lets out the bishop, but with this king this week, it's really asking for trouble all the time. So maybe some combination. If rook e1, you also have knight takes and then bishop e4. And I think winning the exchange is pretty good. Like after e5, maybe you're allowing counterplay? Nah. Ooh, f3. That can't be a fun move to have to play. But he's basically saying you have a pin here, but you can't use it. And in the meantime, I'm just going to solidify my position and try to do this. But I would say that this is also kind of a sad move. Because here, now all of a sudden, h5, g4 becomes so nasty. Because you have to go this at some point. You can't leave yourself pinned forever. And the second that happens, h5, g4 is just like, ugh. Like, get me out of here, you know? So I would say that this is just so dangerous for white. But once again, it's still a difficult position, and black's clock's ticking, so anything can still happen for sure. And actually, there's some dangers. For example, if h5, king here, if g4 immediately, you do have this capture, followed by trying to take here. So it's maybe not super simple. So I'd say king h1 is almost certainly has to be your move. You have to get out of this pin. And then the idea is that on g4 you can take. So the question is, does black have a nicer way to do this? Again, I definitely like improving the knight first and maybe trying it then. That's definitely one option. Yep, he goes with king h1, staying up on the clock, which is very important. And now knight e5. Very logical. Yeah, and the problem is white has to find moves now, which is maybe the hardest part of this whole thing. So maybe it's sensible to try something like this to try to throw in this check, to at least put a piece in the way. And if bishop takes, pawn takes, maybe your bishop uses the e4 square, or you at least have this f-pawn blocking everything. I don't know. I would probably try something like that. So I think bishop c2. The problem with bishop c2, though, you might allow this. Oof. That's pretty nasty, I have to admit. So white actually has a tough decision to make here. Maybe queen e2 first and then trying to do this. It feels very slow, though, and the queen on e2 might come back to bite you because it's on the same file as the rook. So you can see, though, how how difficult it is for me to even like find good moves here. It's just such a tough position. And again, it's all because of this guy, right? Because you can play here, but then g4 might just murder you. Because if takes, now you're just getting cracked on all those squares. And it's basically just like a really strong King's Indian, because unlike in the King's Indian, white has nothing on the queen side. So it's almost like a free attack here. So knight goes back to c2. I mean, I can't say I like this move, but at the same time, it's hard to criticize when the position's so difficult, right? Like, this is a very understandable type of thing where you're like, all right, I just don't want to deal with life, you know? So black's playing knight g6, I assume with the idea of play g4. So once again, I feel like this is very, very difficult for white. And black's also caught up on time. Notice how black's actually up on time now. And I think that that's going to be really significant to the position. So bishop g1's played, trying to at least fix that guy. So, hey, he fixed his bishop. Honestly, that makes you a winner in my book, man. I mean, I know this is a horrible position, but okay, you probably had to take with the king, so you could at least try to run. I think now g4 is just going to be lights out. Yeah, here I think you have to tear here, and then maybe even takes, and then try king f2 to e2. It looks really bad, though. I mean, this is not a kind of survival you want, but probably you had to try. Because I think that if you leave the king in this corner, it's just going to be bad news. So he goes for this. He takes. I mean, the rook comes to h8. I think it's going to be lights out. Because the problem is, yes, you have this, but black's in control over when you open the position. That's the problem. That when you have a position like this, black is the one who's in control. And it makes life so much harder. So here, black has a choice. Black can even allow the endgame, by the way. The endgame is probably crushing because you're still trying to mate. But black decides to keep the queens on the board, and probably that's reasonable as well. The knight on e5 is too strong. The rook's coming here. Yeah, I mean, this is just going to be over. Probably black should just keep things simple and just play rook h8. Don't even bother taking on h3. Although taking on h3 looks perfectly good, I would say, like, don't bother, right? Just make sure no accidents happen. Queen h4 also looks quite good. Really, at this point, it's just a matter of making sure you don't mess it up. So g3 is probably a good move here. You could, of course, trade, but I don't think there's any reason to. Yeah, this is just nice. And white's also going to lose on time. This is the problem. When you have a position like that, you don't want to play too fast as white because you might just mate yourself. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so this should be the end. Okay, I mean, he's allowing queen f3, which maybe isn't necessary, but even f3 here is probably too strong. This definitely was not necessary, though. Okay, he takes and plays rook h2. This is also... Oh, yeah, this is plenty good enough. f3 comes next. This is over. Or doubles. Threatening this mate. Really nice play by black, I have to say. This was really, really beautiful conversion. And just really, really nice play overall by black in this game. Just once they got an f4, they were just merciless with the attack, and just really, 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 really nice play. Okay, so we have 46 seconds till the next round. So Josh is in the lead with hockey. Ended up winning that game. Vinny H2O is in third place with 2.5 out of 3, and then we have Aaron Sunboy with 2 out of 3, Jay Jonathan with 2 out of 3, and Chess Logic also with 2 out of 3. And I guess Moving Hoax had a bye, but they also have 2 out of 3 as well. So again, still a close tournament. We got 2 rounds left. We've played 3 out of 5. And the next round starts in 15 seconds. So let us see. So almost certainly we're going to have hockey against Jay Josh, and we're going to keep an eye on that game. And then we're going to have Vinny H2O playing as well with 2.5. So they could, if the top 2 players draw, Vinny could catch up to them this round. So let's see how this game goes. So we have e45. Petrov. Okay. Yeah, the Petrov, ever since Fabiano played it a lot against Magnus in their match, has become just really popular. And it's kind of interesting because he plays the Petrov and it's known as kind of a drawing weapon. Like you have to know lots of theory, but it's just so solid and so tough to crack. But it also was amazing to me how many of the games became really sharp and interesting, even if White traded to an endgame early. Like, I remember there was some game where Wesley So, I think it was, against Fabi, played the line with, like, Queen E2, Queen E7, and then D3, Bishop G5, or some kind of endgame line, which is, like, really, really dry. And even Magnus played that, and even though it was an endgame, they still got some crazy position. Like, actually, my favorite game from the Carlsen Caruana match ended up in an endgame that looks so harmless, and then all of a sudden the game just exploded. So I think the Petrov, even though it's still, some of the positions can be dry, has kind of gotten a revamp, and a lot of the positions, at least to me, look very, very interesting. So d4, d5, bishop d3, bishop d6. So yeah, there are two main approaches. You can play with bishop e7, knight c6, with the idea on c4 you play knight b4. This is one way that's kind of solid, really just super solid, really tough to crack way. And then bishop d6 tends to lead to more combative positions. So it looks like we're going to see that. So here, castles, castles, and then the idea is White usually plays with c4, c6, and then there are different options. You can play with queen c2. You can play with takes here and then knight c3 type ideas. You can play with rook e1. So there are just numerous options that White can choose from. And again, they all lead to different types of positions. When I was an e4 player, which was already over 10 years ago, I used to really like these systems with here, and then takes and knight c3, and you try to get rook e1, rook b1, and you kind of, they often led to a pawn sack. They were really, really exciting positions. So that was always my particular preference, but honestly, there are so many different lines you can try. So rook e1 is one of many. But knight retreating feels a little bit sad to me. I don't know if this is a theoretical or not. I think usually there's all sorts of systems, like White can play... There's some pawn sack, I think, with the bishop coming here. I don't remember these lines so clearly. It's been a long time since I looked at them. You can also play with bishop f5, I believe, and there's even lines with f5 sometimes. Maybe not immediately, but there are definitely lines where this occurs, and again, it's just really complicated, really interesting stuff. But knight f6 is usually a sign that something's gone wrong. It doesn't mean that you can't play with knight f6, right? But you're usually kind of withdrawing from the center. You're not claiming you did anything with this knight push, so you're just going back. So there are lots of lines with knight f6 in the Petrov, but usually it means that black's playing a little safer. They're surrendering more territory. But I doubt that this could be a horrible move, right? Because it's still very solid. You're still controlling the center. So White decides to go with c5, which is always a committal decision, because one of the nice things about having the pawn here is that you always can put pressure on the center. So if you play a move like knight c3, you're putting nice pressure on the center. And if takes, the bishop on c4 is such a monster, hitting this pawn. You have knight e5 coming in. You're not really afraid of those IQP positions. So the move c5, again, it doesn't make it a bad move, but it's a very committal decision, because it means that you never can put pressure on this pawn again. And you either play this to play for two things. You can either try to do this, but honestly, it's very slow in a position like this. I don't really like that idea. And the other thing is you're basically trying to cramp black. So you're basically saying, look, if your bishop goes here, it's very passive. If it goes here, maybe I pin your knight and you have issues with your knight. And I think that's what White's going for here. But I can't say that c5 was the first move that occurred to me. But again, this could be theory that I just don't know. These are not lines which I've played too much of. But c5 to me doesn't look necessary. Like, I think that White could play knight c3, White could play bishop g5, and just kind of put pressure on the center, whereas this move almost takes pressure off the center, which I'm just not a big fan of. So probably the bishop should go back to c7. I think bishop e7 is just really passive. Maybe it's playable, but to me that's like a sign that you're kind of like, yeah, my position's kind of sad. Bishop c7 I think is the more ambitious move, which is what he goes for. So now I think the proper setup is trying to get this bishop out, followed by knight out. So you have a little space. At some point you're going to want to play b6 as well. probably to try to free up a little bit more room or force white to try to do something like this. So white actually prevents bishop g4 for this reason, so that now these pieces are more cramped. But I definitely think a move like b6 could be seriously considered in these positions, because if b4 a5, you can't play a3 because of takes. So I think that b6 is definitely a move which I would be considering very soon, if not now. Like you could have even played it here, right? Like this would be, I think, a very reasonable move. Instead he goes this route. And I definitely think that like bishop e6 is again very solid as a move, but I would really be tempted to want to break apart these pawns as soon as I can. Because the second this bishop moves, white can at least keep these pawns kind of solid, right? Whereas here, I would say that it's a lot harder to do that, because now you can just do this and it's just really nice. Whereas if you play b6 here, you can't play b4, a5, a3. And I think that if these pawns get broken up, it's going to help black immensely, because then your space at disadvantage is not really a thing. But black's also playing just very sensible moves. White's expanding on the king side, queen side. So yeah, at least to me, this is just not the time for b6. If you're going to play this way, there's no real reason to play b6. But at the same time, I don't think white's doing anything too special. But you can see how this bishop on e6 is just a little bit passive, right? It would rather be out and on a more active square. But yeah, I definitely would have tried b6 at an earlier point when you could have really cracked at those pawns. But here it's kind of an interesting decision, because I think black can still play with a5, and I don't know, even rook b1 is an option for white. But basically white's just trying to say, look, your c6 pawn is always going to kind of be a weakness, and because of the bishop on e6, you really can't generate any active counterplay. And I don't know, this might just be the case. Like, this is one of those positions where it feels like black needs something else. Like, if black had knight e4 and f5 in, then all of a sudden life is okay. You just improve your pieces, you have a plan of pushing on the king side. But here there's just no real active plan. So I think because he missed his chance to play this earlier to break apart the pawns, now the life is just going to be kind of annoying, because you're just going to have this less space forever, and you just don't really have any kind of active counterplay that I would like. So already it's kind of difficult decisions. Again, I probably think you have to play with a5, just to at least give yourself a little bit of room, at least make it so that you're not just kind of suffocating. But it definitely looks like a difficult position. This bishop on e6 is just really a sad piece, honestly, and not having active counterplay is never fun. As far as what black's idea should be, probably something like a5 maybe, and then I would even consider something like this, knight here, bishop here, and knight e6. It looks very slow, but the idea is bishop on d7 will guard this pawn, the knight on e6 can maybe jump, so you're at least getting some kind of active counterplay, and the knight on e6 also hits white's only potential weakness. So something like this makes a lot of sense to me, but at the same time it's very slow and it's a little bit passive. Whereas white can just kind of enjoy their position. They can slowly improve their pieces, they can try to expand on the queen side. Even hops like this are kind of interesting sometimes. Maybe. I don't know. Plenty of options. But I definitely think rook e8 is a move you can play here, and looks okay. Why don't we check in quickly on the other game just to see how it's going? And again, I'm mostly sticking to the leaders, but so let's see, Vinny h2. Yeah, all right. So this game already had a lot of stuff happen. Wait a second. So c4. So Vinny is in 3rd place at the moment, and Chess Logic, I believe, is 2 out of 3. So c6. So we have this line, which is already very sharp. Yeah, so this, I don't know how this e5 line goes. I thought that white's supposed to just play here now and then just take, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Again, it's hard to keep track of all these. But okay, taking is, of course, quite an okay move. Takes, bishop check, knight back to c3, bishop e6. So we're even material. Both sides have slightly weak pawns, but I would say black at the moment looks more active to me. And that's kind of what I would go by, who's more active. Also, I would say that this b3 weak square is going to be really significant here, and this pawn is just not weak enough. So already I kind of I'm kind of opposed to this. So e3, 97. Yeah, e3 is also a little bit of a passive move for my taste. Like, it's already kind of a difficult position, but I feel like you have to try to get like some kind of counterplay, like maybe even e4 and try like some kind of weird pawn sack, or bishop f4, trying to at least dislodge this bishop. I would consider very strongly here. I don't really like White's position if you play passively, which is kind of what he's doing. So it looks like Vinny just kind of won this pawn, but things are a little messy with f5. Wow, yeah, this game's getting really weird. So definitely White has to be careful here. White could just lose by doing stuff like this, but I guess they're trying to get counterplay in a bad position, which makes sense. So I don't know, bishop d5 is also a move. Moving back is not like illegal, but he goes for the most complicated option. So if you just take back here, I guess bishop here to here, and your life is just kind of terrible. So he decides to, even the opposite bishop position, honestly, if you have a pawn on d3 and a bishop on e4, it's still kind of horrible. So he goes for this, bishop back here, takes. And at the moment, black's still up a pawn and with a beautiful knight here. I would say that this is already probably winning, or very close to winning for Vinny. So overall, really nice play. This was well calculated, it looks like, this bishop takes c3 thing. Yeah, I don't know who moved their king and castled. I don't think black's castled. But yeah, so takes. Yeah, I mean, this is just really, really good for Vinny, I think. Like, the rooks come to the center and you're just up a clean pawn. This pawn is just really strong here. And Vinny's also playing very fast, so he doesn't have to really worry about his time either. Yeah, so this is already just really, really bad for White. So it looks like Vinny's going to probably go to 2.5, or sorry, 3.5 out of 4 if they're not careful. So we'll see how the winner of this game goes. So this one, ooh, this does not look right. So he went for, so he played rook e8, which is kind of what I was suggesting, and then he went for a5 and now b5. So b5 is kind of the move you have to calculate every single move, because if you allow b5 at the wrong time, it can end up just really, really horrible for you. But b5 can also just give away stuff, so it really depends on the situation. So here he takes on b5 and allows c6, which to me was counterintuitive. I thought that his idea here would be to take, and then if it captures, then you play here, with the idea that on takes, then you take, and I thought that that was at least somewhat playable. I don't know how playable, but at least it looked possible. And after takes, if takes back, you can always just take with a knight. So, but he took this one, and now after c6, I'm very worried for him. So this is never possible here because of takes. So you have to go back and then takes, and then this pawn is just going to be such a thorn in your side. This knight can't move. So I'd say a position like this, unless you have immediate play, unless you have an immediate way to win back this pawn, it usually means you're just kind of busted, because this pawn is just so annoying. Just, ugh. Yeah. So probably here it's just a matter of being careful for White. f4 is a risky-ish move, but at the same time, if you make it so this knight can never be captured safely, it's probably worthwhile. So yeah, Black, I mean, they have to try like rook here and try to take and move and just anything to win this pawn. Because honestly, if you don't win this pawn, you can almost resign. Like, the game is just gonna be over. Because it's not just a passed pawn. It just keeps all your pieces just so passive, and you usually just can't play a game this way. So yeah. So I'd say a very powerful play by White, and I'd be really, really worried if I were Black here. And there are so many ideas. Like, White can just try to play slowly, but White even has ideas like bishop a4, say, followed by knight b5, and all of a sudden your queen is almost trapped. So I would say that this is just so dangerous. Bishop c8 is never a good sign. I understand, right? You're trying to regroup your pieces a little bit, but you have so many nasty options for White here. Again, bishop a4 followed by knight b5 does not look dumb at all. But White can also probably play this simpler, like even a4 and rook here, something like this. I don't know. Maybe moving this knight somewhere else is also possible. You could also think about targeting this pawn. This pawn is now a weakness, right? But I would say this is just a really, really difficult position for Black. Which means that if J. Josh converts, he'll be at 4-0 going into the last round, which obviously is quite a nice feeling, even though he'll have to probably face someone half a point back, it looks like. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. There's still plenty of game left. But also I would say hockey also has a clock problem, which is that he's almost down to 5 minutes. And again, no increment, so it can be kind of nasty. So white just chooses to play queen b3, which is just probably sensible, right? Because you're hitting this pawn, so black has to deal with this pawn, and then you can just improve your pieces. You don't have to get fancy with it. I would say sometimes when people try to go after these positions, when they blow it is when they play too fancy. They try to be too sophisticated, and sometimes just simple moves are good. And here, you're taking advantage of the fact that you can't take here, this knight ever. You can't take this pawn. And taking advantage of the fact that this is weak. So probably, yeah, the bishop has to go back to e6. Black realizes that. That's probably correct. And now, I mean, white has all sorts of different options. Like, trying to play for f5 is possible, but it's probably not even necessary. Like, even here, just a move like rook c1 is probably decent. You have to watch out for moves like knight e4. That's the one thing I'd say, with the idea of takes in the discovery. But even there, d5 is probably just bad. So I'll be interested to see what white chooses. Again, white can choose moves like this and then trying to take, but in general, you don't want to make the position more exciting. You want to keep it boring, because if you keep this position boring, I think that black's just going to get strangled for space. So very, very nice game so far by white. This b5 idea against a5 is very common. But again, this is why I wanted to play b6, a5 really early in the game for black. That you notice that if you play it later, it's a lot less effective. So white does just indeed strengthen the position with rook to c1. Definitely a very logical course of action, I would say. So white rook to e3 is possible, but again, I don't know that like this is the type of idea you're looking for. I think you're just trying to press in the center and use your very strong pawn. I don't think you want to necessarily go after all of that. So rook goes to c8. Yeah, I don't know. It's a kind of a tricky situation. There are so many ways to play. One idea I would think about is even a move like queen back. The idea of trying to play f5 and, you know, make this bishop feel bad about its life is one potential idea. But you have so many ideas here. Again, I do like this idea of putting a knight on b5. I think that could be kind of nasty as well. But again, I think it's almost a matter of taste at this point. I would rather have the queen somewhere else. Like, honestly, the queen on f3 makes a better impression, because then you can target this pawn and threaten f5, and you don't have to worry about knight e4 with discoveries on the queen. So yeah, I like this approach. I think the queen moving out of the way of this discovery actually makes a lot of sense. So yeah, now this is a threat to trap the bishop, it looks like. So probably black has to do something about that. Playing a move like g6 runs into something like this always. So probably this rook just has to move again so that the bishop has a square. It's unfortunate to have to move back and forth if you're black, but sometimes it's just necessary. Yeah. But yeah, honestly, this queen, if it were on f3, I'd really like it, because then you're threatening this, and you're also keeping an eye on everything. But queen b1 definitely... You just have to be careful. I guess there's this move always. So if you take immediately, I think f5, and probably it's going to be good for white. But after a move like this, you have to at least make sure this pawn does not hang on you. Because even though you might claim you have so much compensation, who cares about the pawn? It's like, well, you don't have to lose a pawn here. Your position's so dominating that there's no reason to kind of sack a pawn for anything. He does decide to take it. And again, sometimes this is sensible just in that, you know, your position's already kind of bad, and you know that life is not going to be great. You just change the position. You just say, look, I'll sacrifice material just so that the position changes, and hopefully it'll be better for me. Objectively, though, I don't think this is a good idea, because I think after f5, your position is just going to be really, really difficult. Because that guy is going to be trapped as far as I can tell. And if you take the rook, I can simply recapture, even with the bishop, for example. Maybe not bishop, because I let go of this. Maybe rook? Something like that. I would also consider takes, by the way. Probably it doesn't work, because you take, but I don't know. That pawn looks kind of nasty. Never win a Morphe. Don't quite know that one. Do not quite know that one. So bishop takes a3. Yeah. So what? F5. Yeah, F5 I assume is coming, right? I think that it's the only logical follow-up. Can black make a comeback here? For sure. I mean, it's still not like dead, right? Like, it's not like you're getting checkmated. It's not like, okay, everything is just dead lost. But it should be an objectively won position for white, I believe. And with this pawn on c6, it's unpleasant. I would also say white has a huge clock lead. So I would say that black is very likely to lose. But of course, a comeback is always possible. These are rapid time controls. Blunders happen. But I would say that, again, as long as this pawn remains on the board, it's just going to be so difficult for black to ever win. And again, in a position like this, I would say the pieces tend to be better than the rooks. So one thing I would recommend for black is you take this rook. I think you have to, right? Like, he's thinking, but you got to take that thing. Maybe you can take here first. It almost doesn't matter. You take... Yeah, he takes the rook first, which is sensible. Probably the rook should take that. Again, I would consider this, especially in a longer game, but probably in a shorter game, it's not worthwhile. So he does this, and then probably you take this guy so you don't weaken yourself more. And then you can consider different things. You might just consider getting the knight out, just, you know, get your pieces out, and then hope your opponent doesn't mate you. He goes for this. This might actually be better, because now you don't bring the queen out, and you also maybe get rid of this guy. But after pawn takes, knight takes, it looks really, really bad. Thank you, Golden Patil. Yeah, people ask this to me all the time, like what would this is my rating on Lee chess, and what would my rating be over the board? And the fact is that it's almost impossible to know these things. Like, there are so many, like, you know, players who are very, very strong over the board. I would probably put myself in this category. Like, over the board, I'm much stronger than online, and especially in like online blitz. Like, not that I can't play, obviously, but it's like my strength is a lot weaker than in over the board classical chess. And there are some players who are absolute monsters at online blitz, but then they play over the board, they're quite a bit weaker. So I would say you can't judge based on someone's Lee chess rating how good they're going to be over the board. It's a different thing. There obviously are similar skills. It's like a GM over the board is probably going to be good online, you know, will be able to be decent, but they're actually very different skills and very different games. So I would say that you can't necessarily judge that. But if you're 1700 on Lee chess blitz, you know, you're obviously, you know, above the average player for sure. And, you know, but I don't know where that's going to put you with an actual rating. Josh better than Stockfish. I don't know about this, but I'm glad you're enjoying the commentary anyway. Yeah, so we'll see. So here again, it looks like, whoa, what happened? Oh, he didn't even take it. So after takes, yeah, I don't know why he's not taking this piece. So here he, maybe there was a blunder somewhere, but I feel you can still take this guy, right? Because if takes, there's queen coming into c8, that looks pretty bad. So it seems like white unnecessarily sacked the exchange, but the position's still crushing probably. Even down the exchange, these pawns and these bishops are just so massively strong. But I feel like white could have gotten the same position, but like with an extra piece. So knight a6 is maybe mandatory now. I guess you can always sack the piece, right? But it's like, it's going to be kind of... The two bishops are going to be way better than the rook here. But yeah, I think you have to play that move. So he plays there. So now he's going to try to probably take here, or maybe try to push something like this. But this has gotten less clear than it was. The problem is that black has only a minute and a half. And white has over almost 4 minutes. So that's a pretty big disadvantage. Also, there are so many moves. For example, the move bishop d7 might be nasty now, because the idea is if rook takes, then this rook hangs with check. So after bishop here, he decides to take the knight, which maybe wouldn't have been my choice. But yeah, here it looked pretty good because you're just going to take this rook. And if it takes, then here. And if knight takes, then you take, and you're still pinned up. So it looks kind of nasty. But I would say that this is definitely like... It feels like white is having to win material back all of a sudden. Whereas before, if they had just taken that piece, it would have been a lot simpler. Queen takes a8 is also possible, by the way. This is a good spot. Takes, queen, takes, king here, takes. But wait, is that the right? Yeah. But I feel like then there's checks at the end. So I feel like you're allowing a lot of stuff that way. Maybe you have a different way to do it. But I would say because this is with check at the end and your king is open, sacrificing your queen is not necessary or probably best. So he goes for this. Is that queen trapped? Wow. I did not see that at all. That's where Stockfish would be better than me. It would spot it immediately. Wow, this queen's just trapped. That's nasty. I guess it's not surprising when you have pieces this good, right? Like, it's one of those things where even though black blundered the piece, my general instinct told me that... Or sorry, white blundered the piece. It seemed like... My instinct told me that black should still be dead. And I didn't see this, but it sometimes happens that, you know when your pieces are really great, that there's always some tactical win. But you still have to find it, right? It's easy to blow it with maybe taking here too early or taking, or playing this too early, because even this was less clear. But he did a nice spot, rook c6, trapping the queen. Really unexpected. So he goes for this. Notice how you can't take the pawn due to checkmate. And again, you have lots of ways to do this. Queen h4 should be plenty good enough. And you're just going for mate. Sometimes going for mate is best technique because you just win. Yeah, it takes here. Or queen check. Yeah, it should be over. And also he's flagging, so. Okay, this was not necessary, but... Wait, what? Yeah, okay, come on. Like, just mate. Like, why? Okay, he made it. Alright, good. So there's one game left going, and it is indeed Chess Logic against Vinny H2O. So yeah, Josh with the lead. I always like when Josh is leading the tournament. So let us see this game. So this was, oh, Vinny didn't do this so smoothly. So yeah, this position, I think he was really just doing quite well. But he gave back his pawn. This was the problem. So yeah, here you should have some way to hang on to this pawn, I thought. But maybe you can't. But I would still say that black's the one who's doing extremely well, even though you're not going to be able to pawn anymore. Just due to the better king, the better structure, the better bishop. But yeah, this was maybe not smart. I think he was depending on this, and then this tactic was available. So they just end up in this endgame. I still think white's position is... black's position is much better. Actually, rook d8 is really nice, yeah. Here, and then... I feel like this was unnecessary, this check on h4. I don't think this accomplished much. But yeah, black's still quite a bit better. He grabs another pawn. White grabs a7, though. Yeah, I don't know. This feels like a pawn you can take, doesn't it? So yeah, that might have been better. But he goes for this, which I think is really unclear. Like, this was maybe not the best course of action. Like, for example, pawn takes pawn should almost certainly be a draw now. So I think that Vinny messed this up a little. But time is getting to chess logic. Keep in mind, there is no increment whatsoever. So I think that this was maybe a poor decision. Taking here, I think, would have led to just a draw. Now, maybe black's doing well again, although this pawn is actually quite strong. So maybe this is actually a little bit dangerous. Yeah, in this position, I might have tried, like, putting the rook behind quicker or something. Wow, though. Quite something. So now, yeah, this pawn... So I think, though, you should try to push immediately, right? Because you can't actually stop this pawn so easily when the rook gets behind. So I would say that probably here, rather than going for the king up, you should probably do it with the... immediately. So this is also probably a mistake. You can probably go back and gain a few tempi and wait for the pawn to go farther. Trying to take immediately is kind of tough. Now I think actually, also with the time, like keep in mind chess logic has 11 seconds. So I think that this was actually a pretty severe mistake. You should probably try to play rook here and try to go back. But you have an issue. If rook here, maybe there's check and then push. So maybe you should try it this way. Go back this way and then try to push your pawn. And I think that you have to gain time with your pawn. Wow, he made it in time. Very nicely done. So what a game, what a turnaround. Vinny looked like he was outplaying him, but he ended up getting mated just in time. So wow, what a win, and this really makes a big impact on the tournament standings. Because if Vinny had won that, he would have been within half a point. Whereas now Josh ensures he at least tie for first. With one more game to go, I'm going to refill my iced tea. I will be back. But one more game to go should be exciting. All right. So let us see. It looks as if all right, go to this one. Oh, it looks like J Josh is disconnected. All right, we can go back to this game later. All right, so okay, nope, they're back. So let's see. So this is a game for first place. So let me just see this updated standing. So J Josh is in first with 4-0, and then a huge tie for second through fourth. So between Hockey, Aaron, Sunboy, and Chess Logic 906. So let us see how this one goes. So, J Josh, like any true professional. Oh no, I was gonna say it was an exchange French. It's an exchange Carol, not the same. But it's trying to play pretty safe, probably. So, because a draw clinches him first. But sometimes, honestly, people try to play for a draw as white in the last round of a tournament, and they end up just kind of playing badly. So h3, a little bit safe, like preventing bishop g4 a little bit excessively, I would say. But obviously, this is perfectly playable. So we'll see how things go. I mean, again, like there used to be like the setups I knew were with bishop d3 and c3 against knight c6. You can also, of course, play with c4 as more pan-up Botvinnik attack, where you're playing for IQP and playing more aggressively. There's also systems where you put the bishop on f4 early, is also playable, and it almost reminds me more of a London system than anything else. Because after knight c6, it kind of transposes a bit to a London. But knight f3 h3 is a little bit unusual for me. Not that it's unplayable, of course. So here, actually, g6, of course, is playable, but there's also, like, options of knight b4 I don't think are stupid, with the idea that if bishop goes here, you go here. You always want to trade that bishop. And if the bishop moves back, then you go here. And all of a sudden, it's like, man, that's actually kind of annoying. Because black gets a very active position. You don't want to have to play here, and then black's super active. So I would say allowing knight b4 is actually not necessarily something you want to do. Because giving up the bishop also is a little bit But of course, it's all like just minor stuff. Like obviously you can play this way, and it's perfectly solid and perfectly fine. Let me see. So bishop g7, black's just developing normally. I would say Josh, for how early it is in the game, is playing very slowly. I'm wondering if this is not a system he normally plays. So one of black's typical ideas in these kind of positions is they play a bishop to f5, even though, yep, and he does it, even though you allow takes. And the reason is because after something like this, you put a knight on e4 with a pawn on e6. And even though you have those doubled pawns and potentially a weaker king, that knight on e4, the secure control over that square is really nice. If white allows a bishop trade, you're in general just pretty happy. So sometimes white even blacks off with the bishop, just so that you're left with this piece here, which can be at least a little awkward. Sometimes white does maneuvers like this. So there are lots of ways to kind of play this position, but I would say that this is relatively normal still so far. Nothing too crazy has happened. But yeah, a lot of the times allowing g takes f5 can lead to disaster if your king is open and if there's a way to take advantage. But as it is, someone is asking, what is the elo of Josh Friedel? The elo of Josh Friedel is about 2550, a little over maybe, something like this. I haven't checked my elo in a long time. But anyway, I like answering questions in the third person though. It's a lot of fun. So bishop f5, yeah, so he does go for the capture. It's interesting, it leads to more double-edged positions, I would say, but it also can be dangerous. And I'd also like to note that black hasn't castled yet, so playing with rook g8 and castling queenside is at least not impossible. I don't want to say for sure it's guaranteed. I think castling kingside is a very reasonable approach, but it's not completely unwarranted to try to do that. So knight bd2. So yeah, e6, knight e4 is definitely possible. He just goes with knight e4 immediately. Also very reasonable. So I don't know, you can tell though that black's more familiar with the position than white. White's spent a lot of time, has been unsure of their moves, and black's been playing pretty quickly. To play bishop f5 quickly without, you know, batting an eye to allow this usually means you're confident, you know the position. And it seems like black's still very confident. It doesn't mean that, you know, black's going to win or anything, but it definitely is kind of nice to be familiar with the position. Whereas Josh, I'm wondering if he chose, because he's 4-0, I'm wondering to try to play too safely, if he chose something he didn't normally choose, or if he just wasn't as sure of the opening. In any case, knight b3 makes a lot of sense, because he wants to put the bishop on f4 to control a lot of dark squares. Maybe at some point play knight c5 and try to mix up the game, or try to push on the queen side. So I would still say that black's position is good, but white's doing just fine after a move like bishop f4, which he does. And now there's a choice. Of course, you can castle kingside or you can try to go queenside. In my experience in general, trying to castle queenside here can be very risky because you're dealing with this bishop. And ideas like either rook c1, c4 someday, or trying to play knight c5 and then trying to play b4, b5 kind of hit you pretty fast. So I would say that castling queenside, it's possible, but it always carries like an element of risk. Knight e7 to g6 is not at all a bad idea. Sometimes then the bishop drops back, and then I still try to play on the queen side. But there's also ideas like knight c1 to d3 is actually not so stupid either, just trying to secure the center a little bit. Because sometimes you don't necessarily want to allow the capture, and then you have to withdraw a pawn from the center. Sometimes the pawn can become weak. He goes for knight c1 to d3. So yeah, I mean, lots of different options, obviously. Yeah, knight e7 to g6 definitely is a reasonable idea, probably. Quite a few different ones. Sometimes ideas like this are possible, but they're a little one-dimensional, and it's not always clear the rook on g8 is going to be that powerful. Especially because your bishop just doesn't have that many squares, right? Like your bishop would have to move, but the bishop here looks a little weird. Maybe it's okay, but I don't know. Black decides to play on the queen side, which definitely makes sense. Because you have this strong knight, but the fact is that if you can put pressure on this pawn, it is also fairly logical. But again, you always have to be careful. I'd say when you have a setup like this kind of pawn structure, like it looks like really powerful. You have this knight on e4. It's easy to kind of get over enthused about things like this. And I don't think it's like bad at all, but I would say that you have to be careful because if the position opens up, especially in a way that's not so favorable, like you can end up with a bad position because you have all this looseness, right? Like if somehow I get in c4 takes and I do this, all of a sudden your position is garbage, right? So you have to be very careful when you get this structure. But it doesn't mean it's bad, right? So here black's trying to play for b4. Another option for black, by the way, was to try to put this knight on c4 is also not an uncommon idea. But I like his approach also. Just trying to play for b4 and trying to put pressure. So queen b6 played, rook e1. So white's trying to pick up the pace a little, but I definitely think that b4 is reasonable. I don't really know what rook e1 does. I guess maybe rook c2 and you try to safeguard your position a little bit, but another option for white is you could try to play something like this to try to exchange off a few guys. Maybe try this to provoke a move like f6 at some point. Or trade off the bishops, which would leave black's king a little bit bare. So I don't know, something like this may have been maybe preferred for me. Rook e1 feels a little bit slow. Because b4 is just coming so fast, right? Like it's just hitting you and then you have to worry about this pawn being loose. But I definitely think black should try to go for it, right? Because otherwise, what are they doing with all these moves? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird because it's kind of like a normal Carlsbad structure where you have this against this. And you're trying to play for this, but it is weird because you have this pawn here, which means that sometimes there are ideas that you have to be careful of doing because your king's a little more open, and other times it's even better for you because you have that better control over that knight. Normally that knight's not so secure in Carlsbad. Like, you don't just plunk a knight here and are happy with your life, right? So it's kind of an interesting difference, you know? So even though it's kind of like a Carlsbad, you have to be careful because it's really not exactly the same. So once again, I definitely think b4 is the approach that's correct, but it's usually a good idea to think twice before playing a committal move, so I don't mind that he's thinking. I guess I could quickly check on other games while he's pondering b4. So the game for second place between Chess Logic and Aaron Sunboy, I'm assuming? Or no, Hockey and Aaron Sunboy, sorry. Chess Logic is playing number 1. Oh, this game already finished? Oh no. Aw, that's tragic. So he fell for a trick in the c3 Sicilian, so yeah, bishop e5 and then here. And the idea is that on knight here you take and this bishop still hangs. That is brutal. That's really sad. Well, I feel really bad for Hockey. That's pretty tough. That's not a fun way to lose, but it's kind of an illustration of why even early in the opening you have to be cautious about what you're doing. It's easy to play on autopilot, but you always want to check what are threats, what are checks, what are tactics, and it's easy to keep your guard down in the opening and then put your guard back up when you're less familiar. But I'd say even early in the opening, keep that guard up. Make sure you see your opponent's checks. Make sure you see their threats, because losing like this is just never fun. And you don't want to have to experience this. So I really feel sorry, but sometimes lessons like that are important because they mean in the future you're not going to do something like that. You're going to play more cautiously. But wow, what a game. All right, let us check back in on this one. So he decides to play with f6. This I'm less sure of. For a lot of reasons. First of all, I think that this is going to be so hard to do with these pawns being loose. So for example, even if the bishop retreats or something like this, like I really don't know if you want to play this move. And if you're trying to do it just to restrict the knights, I think that it's a little bit overkill, because here, for example, if I can ever move the knight and play f3, you're going to have issues with the e6 pawn as well. So I'm really not a fan of this move. I feel like b4 was kind of asking to be played, and at least I didn't see a reason why it wasn't good. So I see someone suggesting queen c4 going for bishop h6, I'm assuming, not bishop h3. Yeah, I mean, b4 queen c1 is definitely possible, but even there I think I can take this pawn, try to play maybe queen b3 and try to take your pawn, something like this. I still think it was quite playable for black. I could also play something like this, trying to take here if you put a queen on c1. I think putting a queen on c1 has its risks, by the way. Because I think, yeah, then if here, then I have takes, and life becomes kind of complicated for you. So I don't know. I would say that maybe it was possible, but it also looked risky. But this looks like the wrong approach. I think this makes... I think f6 makes b4 worse, because now your e6 pawn is just going to be loose forever. So you have to deal with moves like knight c5 randomly, and then you can't ever take it because takes, and this pawn hangs. I would be, yeah, this is not a turn of events I would enjoy. Now knight c5 is still a move here. And any kind of opening of the position is going to be really rough for black because this pawn is just going to be loose. So I think you have to be so careful with moves like this because it just loosens your whole position. And now this is not stable at all. So, yeah, I would say that even though I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, I would say that I would be very, very cautious as black now. I feel like one wrong step and you can end up with a position where you just have all sorts of only pawn weaknesses, and your bishop's also shut down. So in a lot of these battles for the queen side, you're playing without a bishop. So I would be very, very worried here. So many options here. Again, knight c5 type moves I definitely would consider. Taking on b4 is also not entirely dumb. I mean, normally this is a bad pawn structure, but the fact is the board's completely open now. So you can deal with moves like rook e6. Whoa, bishop d6. That is a bolt from the blue. But does it work? So we have a few different options. I can throw in this capture at some point. And if knight takes d6, queen takes king here, knight here. Now granted, my structure is completely disintegrated, which is definitely in your favor. However, that's a piece. So maybe there's takes d5, there's takes here. This is quite a move though. But I don't think it actually can work that well. Like for example, even if I play knight takes d4 here, and then take this, I don't know if you've actually helped yourself so much. So this might be an example of actually being a little bit too intricate. Like this is a little bit too much. Keep in mind, I can also throw in this capture, right? So takes, knight takes d4, knight takes d4 here. You could take this guy, but I don't know. It doesn't feel like you've helped yourself that much. So bishop d6 is quite a move. But I don't know if objectively it's actually the strongest. But quite a creative move, I have to say. I applaud this the creativity, even if objectively I'm not so sure it's best. Also, by the way, exchange sacks galore are also in the air. Maybe those aren't so good though. But okay. So black decides to call the bluff and says, look, you don't have anything. I am taking this piece. What a cool game though to see. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's honestly this position just looks like a mess because it looks like after knight takes here, I don't know. This looks starting to look quite good for white, right? So he takes first, which makes sense. You have to recapture that guy. And then knight takes here. You have this pin. Knight takes d5. I mean, I think knight takes d4 was maybe the appropriate response. That looked actually pretty good for black. But this, I'm starting to think that this is just bad, which means that this is quite a sack. I mean, again, even if knight takes d4 was good against bishop d6, this is quite an idea. Yeah, so knight takes b4. So now you have 2 pawns for the piece, and you're going to get a third. So 3 pawns for the piece is already definitely decent, right? But you also have this knight, which, how do you deal with this knight? Because there's no rook defending it. Like, this is, obviously, you can at least take the rook, right? And this knight can't move. So how exactly were you going to deal with this? Yeah, I think black got a little too greedy. I think taking the bishop on d6 was just a bad approach. Even giving up a pawn would have been probably better than this. But I don't think it was necessary. I think knight takes d4 moves were really strong. But again, you can see how crucial the moves are, right? Like after bishop d6, you have to really take your time. Even if you're playing a short time control game, to make sure you get it right. Do you take here first? Do you not? Do you take this bishop? Do you not? Do you take here or no? And I think that you can even take on a1 and then take here, bishop f8, take here, and try to sack and exchange. I don't think that works either. But it's definitely in the air and something to consider. But I think that this response of knight takes d4 is so important. I think that that's the key. But again, I want you guys to notice the only reason why this tactic even remotely works is because you've played f6. This f6 move, because it weakens the e6 pawn, because it makes the whole position really loose. It just makes black's life kind of miserable. And it's the only reason why this tactic really works. So it takes, knight takes b4, and now I think that it's really bad. So someone mentions rook a6, which is maybe a decent attempt. But first of all, I could just take it, but even better, I think, is I can check and then take with the queen, and that's a whole rook. So I actually think this is just a dead loss position. So the real question is, how does black fight on? Because obviously you'd rather not resign. So I assume that you just have to move the rook somewhere, maybe allow knight takes knight, and then try to grab this pawn. But it's even hard to do that, because I'm threatening this. If rook b8, knight takes, now you have a rook hanging, and I'm threatening check. No. The problem is that not only are you losing your piece back, right? But your whole structure is disintegrated. You have this, you have a weak king, you have a bad bishop. If you were up a piece, I'd say, okay, you know, it's an interesting, unclear position, right? Because you at least have a piece for your troubles. Although, honestly, even a piece for this would be probably not enough. But you're actually going to lose your piece back. The problem is you lose the piece back and you still have all these positional deficiencies and the deficiency with your king. I think this just makes this position completely unsalvageable. But again, these guys have shown to be really resourceful players. So we'll see what black comes up with. This is, I would say he should have thought a little bit more about taking this piece, but I'd say now is a good moment to use up some time to find at least a way to play on. Because you have to have some form of counterplay. So one option I might consider here is actually just playing king h8. So the idea is that you give up this rook, but this knight, but of course then I can take So you give black a wide choice. And this is actually part of my idea. Sometimes it's easier to play when we have only one option, right? Because it's like, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but okay, this is the only move that makes sense. But you play here, they can take this knight, they can take here, they can take here. It at least gives them options. And my idea is that if they then take like this, I at least have knight g5 trying to disrupt you a little bit. So that if you take, then you kind of at least fix my structure a little. So I would at least think about trying to play king h8. So he plays bishop f8. So he's trying to force the hand, trying to force knight takes. But I think knight takes is what white wants to play anyway. So knight takes e6 is just a really annoying move because it not only does a lot of damage, but it also threatens the move knight e7 check, winning the queen. So this is just really, really nasty stuff. There probably are other wins as well. Knight takes d5, I would suspect, wins. Because you fork the queen and this pawn with check. That probably is completely crushing. Queen takes c6 is kind of a simple way to win if you want to play the endgame. You'll just have endless options as far as how to win. And the key is just not to screw it up and not to use too much time, right? You're playing a 15-minute game with no increments. So I think knight takes c6 is maybe the simplest. There is rook a6 you have to watch out for. But you have many antidotes to this. For example, even an knight e7 check if you have to. Bishop takes, queen takes is still completely crushing. But knight takes here looks like really strong. Because then you're just going to take here, and the king is just going to be hosed. You're just going to take here. It's just too much hanging, too much looseness. He decides to take on c6, which is reasonable. I think this is the best try. To try to at least force them to trade it off. Yeah, he does it this way, but now I think you can just start gobbling up these pawns. And then go after black's king, which is obviously atrocious. So maybe queen takes d5 is a good move here. So now you're threatening knight e7 check, skewering this, and you're also just trying to take everything, and you're keeping black pinned. So queen takes d5 I like, he takes on f5, probably good enough. I definitely like taking on d5 though to create the additional threat. So here, I'm guessing it's still also dead. Like probably you should try taking, but it's pretty horrible. But again, you know, there's no reason to give up here. It's a short time control game. So he tries to make threats, rook a2. The problem with this stuff like this is that even if you have to just play rook f1, you're not really doing anything. So rook f1, something like that. But probably as good a try as any, honestly. Like this is a good attempt. So probably rook f1 is the most sensible. Just keep everything at bay, keep everything guarded. I'd say this makes the most sense to me. You could also move the f3 knight, so moves like this are actually not so stupid with the idea of coming in. Feels a little fancy, but it also looks quite strong. I'm sure you have many ways to win. That's sometimes the part of the problem. Like, if you have many ways to win, sometimes you can use too much time trying to think of them. Like, you notice Josh is using his time here, which is wise, but at the same time, you have to watch out you don't just burn it all. So rook f1, most sensible choice, I think. Yeah, I mean, honestly, a position like this, I feel like the way you don't win this is not by like not being the most decisive, but by just not like screwing it up by like, oh, I blundered this. So the most important thing is you take pawns when you can. You weaken your opponent's king, and you don't let your opponent get to your king at all. You basically just keep your king nice and safe. You take as many pawns as you can. And quite honestly, like probably your opponent will blunder at some point because the position is so hard to hold. There are some positions I think you have to play really precisely to win because there aren't that many paths. But a position like this, I feel like the most important thing is just take your opponent's pawns, leave their king weak, don't screw it up. You know, keep your king nice and safe. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's not trying to mate his opponent as fast as possible. He's just trying to capture pawns and win the game. And I think this is very sensible. So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing really for black to do. It's maybe you can try bishop d6 and at least pretend to play actively. But quite honestly, there's just nothing. There's no even back rank trick I can even see. But I would at least try it. You know, you have to, if you know you're going to lose anyway, at least lose playing active moves. I'm sure that there are wins by force after this. For example, knight here probably should win the game. But I would at least give it a try. He plays rook e2, which I guess makes sense, trying to cover some squares. But moves like knight e5, for example, look completely killing. You can also just go after the d5 pawn probably in some way. But I don't know, knight e5 looks just really strong, right? Because if knight takes, you're just threatening queen f7 check. The black king is bare and you're up 2 pawns. Knight g5 he chooses, also plenty good enough. So now if knight takes, queen takes, you can just collect this pawn. This is a nice way to do it. So I'd suspect Josh is going to be 5-0 this tournament. So really, really nice event by him. So we will see. Yeah, so black takes it. Probably they had to, but this is pretty dead. I guess we can check back to make sure, but I mean, we'll see. Are there any other kind of interesting games going on? So there's only one other game. This is the other game between Chess Fans and St. Louis N5. So white's up a pawn in this endgame. It's fairly clean pawn, I would say. But still some work to win, right? Like the king will probably chase the rook out. Then the rook maybe comes in somewhere. And I'd say there's still plenty of work left to do here. It seems like white's just moving back and forth, though, which seems kind of weird. But I guess, oh, they have no time. 34 seconds against 310. Black declines a draw. So basically, black's trying to flag white here. But okay, objectively, white with the extra pawn should be doing pretty well. Even with the knight against the bishop, probably the knight should reroute itself and then maybe try to get the rook in the game. But let's check back to make sure that Josh wins the event here. Because there is 2 minutes left. Of course, things can happen. Yeah, so here again, there are probably forced wins all over the place, but the key is that you don't screw it up. So here, queen check is the easiest win, because then you can play either knight here check or knight here check, and you win the queen by force. And this is what he plays. I think this should end it. He's up on time as well. So yeah, just the key is just bishop here, knight check, and then you win the queen. That should be the end of the game. There's also choices. If bishop here, you can probably check and win the rook. But obviously winning the queen is a little bit better. So I'm assuming that he either resigns here or the game is over in a couple moves. Let's just check to make sure. Yep. So now will he choose queen g4 check? Will he choose knight e7 check? He goes with the winning of the rook. Winning the queen was probably objectively strongest, of course, but this is plenty good enough. This is the thing, like when you have a position like this, you don't have to find the absolute best 100% way to win. You just have to find a way that's clear, and being up a queen, being up a rook for a bishop and 3 pawns is plenty clear. So this should pretty much do it. So we'll see. I mean, obviously he has to be careful not to lose on time. Which reminds me, I wonder how the other way went. I wonder if white actually lost on time here. So this one, rook takes f4. Oh, I'm assuming there was time. Yeah. So here, yep, just no time. So even though white was up some material, he just gave away his rook because probably pretty moving. It's the problem when you don't have increment time controls, right? Like I understand why they do it, of course, because if you have increment time controls, it's really hard to predict the end of an event and stuff like that. But I would say that when you don't have increment, you risk this kind of thing, that you'll have games which are end kind of stupidly. But it also means that people have to manage their time, right? They have to play quickly, but they also, they have to take their time at certain moments, but they also have to choose when, all right, here I just have to play fast. And that's, again, how people used to have to do it. So, but I would say definitely that you have to be careful not to get super low when you're dealing with non-increment time controls. So white decides to trade to this endgame. Quite honestly, it's amazing black made it this far, but yeah, he decides to take the bishop. By the way, guys, you never have to take the bishop. Just play king here, check, bring your king in, take the bishop when they're going to resign, But of course, this is plenty good enough. And yeah, I mean, I suspect that resigns will come soon. Yep. All right, and the game is over. So let us see. So the winner was Josh 007. So congratulations. Always happy when Joshes win. Aaron's son came in second, and then Vinny H2O came in third. So again, congratulations. Really interesting games. Really fun tournament. I hope you guys enjoyed the commentary. I'm going to be the St. Louis Jimmy Rez for the next week as well. So I'll have a few lectures tomorrow on here. So a couple, like a lecture for kind of more beginner type players, a lecture for slightly intermediate, and then a puzzles lecture. And I'll be doing a bunch of activities next week as well for the club. So definitely stick around for those. And again, thank you again for watching.